Was I expelled from Hogwarts? Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 276 Exaggerated Pectoral Muscles. As Ralph had said, at the speed of the Mayflower, in a few days Myrcella would have to cross the entire Atlantic alone to return to her home in the Aegean Sea. So, when they passed the Azores, Ralph bid her farewell. Accompanying Myrcella, besides Helen who was going to be subjected to fish torture, was the Cabro dragon. With it protecting Myrcella, reaching Greece safely shouldn't be too much of a problem. The Kelpie seemed quite reluctant to part with the Cabro dragon, which was understandable, given that it had acted as the dragon rider many times while the dragon was petrified. However, the Cabro dragon didn't seem to have much affection for the Kelpie and Ralph, even harboring a hint of hostility. The former injected a large amount of its blood and bone, while the latter drained a large amount. Ralph had his own explanation. He had used precious mandrake on the Cabro dragon, so taking some blood as compensation was reasonable. If it were Professor Snape, he wouldn't have spared even feces and keratin, let alone blood. Of course, Ralph might have smoked a bit too much, but it wasn't intentional. Like the cafeteria lady, everyone has moments when their hands slip. Ralph gave the nautical chart and logbook he obtained from the ghost ship to Myrcella, keeping copies for himself. Myrcella's hope was rekindled, and she decided to go home first, recuperate for a while, and then go to the North Sea. The girl also invited Ralph to search for the Fountain of Good Fortune with her. Ralph wasn't very willing to go. After all, that island sounded dangerous, just like he didn't want to go with Helena to rob her mother's grave. Perhaps Myrcella could team up with Helena. One wanted to break the curse, and the other wanted to be resurrected. They were perfect partners. While the Mayflower was staying in the Azores, Ralph also spent some time on the island with the Delacour family. The Azores are located in the east-central North Atlantic, a volcanic archipelago, and an important supply point for Atlantic shipping routes. In the Middle Ages, Cape Bojador on the west coast of Africa was considered the end of the world by Europeans and was known as the Horn of Death. On the maps of that time, the waters near Cape Bojador were depicted with a pair of devil's hands, leading Muggles to believe that sailing further would plunge them into an abyss. However, as the Portuguese ships passed Cape Bojador, they not only avoided the abyss but also unexpectedly discovered new islands, the Azores. A famous tourist destination, these islands were home to a group of bikini-clad witches playing thrilling beach Quidditch. Mrs. Delacour took Fleur and Gabrielle shopping. Ralph and Mr. Delacour, as their companions, took on the responsibility of carrying the bags. The two sat on stone benches outside the shops, admiring the white, round beach Quidditch from afar. Ralph was truly just learning the game, at least, that was his pure and upright intention, without a trace of ulterior motive. As for Mr. Delacour, he knew all too well. Unfortunately, the Mayflower didn't stay long before departing the Azores. In Captain Carlos's words, they had delayed too long. In the past, they would have already reached their destination. To save time, he had to shorten the stops at many islands, which was undoubtedly a bad thing. The good news was that the journey went smoothly thereafter. There were no more attacks, ghost ships, or pirate raids, and even the weather was fine. Without any heavy rain, the Mayflower arrived in Bermuda in just 2 days and docked in Hamilton, the capital city. It's only about 900 kilometers from the North American continent, and the Mayflower will arrive in the United States the next morning. To Ralph's surprise, Bermuda, as a British autonomous overseas territory, actually had a department of the Ministry of Magic stationed there. Upon learning that Ralph was on the Mayflower, Director Anthony even came aboard to see him and invite him to dinner. The Ministry of Magic had already issued a document to Hamilton regarding the Black Incident, and Anthony naturally knew the significance of this rising star in the British wizarding world. His main purpose in being so attentive was to inquire about Minister Fudge's handling of Crouch. Recent developments seemed unfavorable for Crouch. He might be suspended and held accountable. Anthony desperately wanted to leave Bermuda and return to Britain. Crouch, as the Director of International Cooperation at the Ministry of Magic, would have a vacancy if he were suspended. Even if he couldn't become the director, Being a street office manager in Diagon Alley back in London would be better than toiling away in this remote Bermuda. In Anthony's view, although Ralph was just a teenager, as a rising star, he could at least help gather some information, if not put in a good word for him with Fudge. Ralph genuinely didn't know about this, only vaguely declining a few times before politely refusing Anthony's invitation. The boy quickly found Fleur and Gabrielle on the deck. The two sisters were looking at the sea. "Ralph, look over there," Gabrielle shouted. Ralph looked up and saw tens of thousands of fish breaking through the waves on the blue sea, weaving and intertwining in midair. They soared through the white spray, forming a dazzling array of parabolas. The fish shimmered with iridescent colors under the setting sun, a breathtaking sight. "They're flying fish," Rove explained to Gabrielle. "They can leap more than 10 meters out of the water and stay airborne for over 40 seconds. They're amazing creatures." "Wow, fish have wings," Gabrielle exclaimed in surprise. "Those aren't wings," Rove chuckled. "They're the pectoral fins. Flying fish have exceptionally well-developed pectoral fins, so much so that they resemble bird wings. Similarly, their ability to take flight from the water isn't related to their wing-like pectoral fins, but rather to the rapid flapping of their tails as they swim towards the surface, generating extra thrust." At this moment, the deck was filled with passengers, all admiring the spectacle, and many even tried to catch the flying fish soaring through the air. But they were agile, with a powerful tail. A quick flick of the tail allowed them to turn and escape. Gabrielle couldn't catch one and looked anxious. Rove snapped his fingers, trapping a flying fish in a water balloon, which floated into his hand. Suddenly, a ding sounded in the boy's mind. A wild flying fish has been detected, triggering a side quest. Complete 100% taming of the flying fish. Reward: a well-developed pectoral muscle. Upon completing 100% taming of the flying fish, you will possess a well-developed pectoral muscle, conservatively estimated to be a teacup. Rove was stunned. "Your pectoral muscles are way too exaggerated." He quickly tossed the flying fish to Gabrielle, afraid that if he held it in his hands any longer, he would tame the thing. Rove couldn't help but sigh. When could he transfer the magic rewarded by the system to the people around him? Chapter 277 Mr. Scamander, you are under arrest. Under Captain Carlos's leadership, the Mayflower caught quite a few flying fish, so dinner became flying fish pasta, Bermuda style. The Bermuda Islands, as a transit point for maritime and air travel, are renowned worldwide, but even more so for their supernatural phenomena and disappearances. The reason is simple: this sea is home to a large number of magical creatures, including but not limited to various sea serpents and monsters. Other seas also have sea serpents and monsters, so why aren't they as famous? Because the Bermuda Islands fall under the jurisdiction of the British Ministry of Magic, but are isolated overseas, far from Britain, and only have a single Department of Ministry of Magic officials stationed there. This department, in reality, doesn't even have an office. With a shortage of wizards and unwilling to let the Magical Congress of the United States intervene, various bizarre events occur frequently, even making it impossible to erase Muggle memories. However, things have improved considerably in recent years, as the Magical Congress of the United States manages the area independently, completely ignoring Britain. With the rise of Grindelwald and Voldemort, and the outbreak of two wizarding wars in Europe, the power of the British wizarding community was far less than before, and they no longer had the ability to interfere with the Magical Congress of the United States. Fudge, the minister, could only lodge a few curses in his office, such as "Finally, my son beat me up," to vent his frustration. The night passed peacefully, and the next morning, the Mayflower headed straight for New York. As the three-masted ship entered the Hudson River estuary, the Statue of Liberty appeared before everyone's eyes. The goddess's lips were tightly closed. She wore a radiant crown, a loose Roman-style robe, her right hand holding a torch aloft, and her left hand clutching a tablet symbolizing the American Declaration of Independence. As New York's most famous landmark, the world's largest bronze statue, from the sea, she seemed only slightly taller than the Tower of London. However, as the Mayflower approached the harbor, the statue's form became increasingly terrifying. The statue's shadow was so thick it blotted out the sky. Ralph, along with Fleur and Gabrielle, stood on the deck, craning their necks to see the Statue of Liberty's head. It was hard to imagine that such a massive statue had once been made invisible by a wizard using a disappearance charm. This performance took place in 1983, when wizard David Copperfield, posing as a magician, performed for Muggles, using magic to make the Statue of Liberty disappear before the audience. Of course, he was also imprisoned by the Magical Congress of the United States for a period of time for violating the Act of Secrecy. Meanwhile, the Mayflower had moved away from the Muggle ships and entered a wide, green waterway that stretched straight to a wizarding port. Approaching New York Harbor, Ralph picked up his suitcase and said goodbye to the Delacour family. Only Gabrielle remained silent, hiding behind Fleur. She hadn't spoken all night after hearing that Ralph was disembarking in New York and wouldn't be going to Hawaii with him. Rove walked over to Gabrielle, knelt down, looked at the girl, and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Still angry, the little girl in the white dress mumbled, "No, I'm not angry." "Then why didn't you say goodbye?" Gabrielle looked like she was about to cry. "Rove, I wanted you to come with us to Hawaii." "What about after Hawaii?" Rove asked gently. "We always have to part ways, right?" "Gabrielle, no friend can stay on the same ship forever. Someone will always get off first, and you'll keep making new friends." The little girl didn't speak, but just lowered her head, looking at her toes. "Gabrielle, after we part, it's not like we'll never see each other again." Rove smiled. "The Quidditch World Cup is in England next year. You'll come to see me, right?" Gabrielle didn't speak. She reached up and wiped away her tears. "Huh? You don't want to see me again next year?" Ralph exclaimed in surprise. The little girl wrinkled her pretty face. "I'm busy being sad." Ralph laughed, ruffled Gabrielle's hair, and gazed at the girl. "I'll miss you both." "I'll miss you too." Gabrielle ran to Ralph, kissed him hard on the cheek, and then whispered in the boy's ear, "When I grow up, that witch named Sherry will be old. You fire her, and I'll become your assistant." Ralph stood up, looked at Fleur, and smiled as he extended his hand. "I should go." Fleur took Ralph's hand, then suddenly stepped forward and gently hugged him. "Ralph, thank you for saving my sister. Take care, and remember to write to me." Ralph was caught off guard, but he quickly regained his composure and said with clear eyes, "Yes, Fleur, you too, be careful." The two released each other, Fleur blushing and glancing awkwardly at the boy. Ralph, carrying his black leather suitcase, turned and left the Mayflower. Carlos, sitting in the captain's cabin, watched the blond boy disembark from afar and let out a soft sigh of relief. Finally, the most dangerous guy is gone. Sigh. I've been shipping for 30 years, and this is the first time I've felt so apprehensive. I'll never pick up a wizard who's even remotely associated with magical creatures again. His heart was too fragile, he couldn't take it. But at least he was safe. He'd send Scamander to the Magical Congress, then go on vacation himself, which would give him some time to recuperate. Just then, the first mate rushed in, shouting anxiously, "Captain, something terrible has happened." "What is it?" "Why the rush?" Carlos frowned. "Did you lose at the betting again?" "Which team did you bet on?" "I bet on the Mexican Quidditch team to win." "No. I mean," the first mate took a deep breath. "MRS. Helen, she's arrived, but I haven't seen her disembark. I just knocked on the door, but no one was there. She seems to have disappeared." Ralph strode off the Mayflower and walked along the road. In the distance, a group of wizards from the Magical Congress of the United States were blocking the checkpoint, checking passports and luggage. Ralph, a seasoned veteran, casually carried his black trunk and walked over. Suddenly, a tall girl approached from afar. She was wearing a standard Muggle policewoman uniform, the brim of her police hat pulled down, obscuring most of her face. Her most attractive feature was her pair of incredibly long and slender legs, encased in alluring black stockings. Ralph had barely glanced at the black stockings and beautiful legs, I mean the police badge, when he saw the policewoman walking straight towards him. The policewoman was nimble. She kicked Ralph in the shin, twisted his arm, and took handcuffs from her waist, cuffing his wrists. Ralph was completely bewildered. These days, looking at a police badge is illegal? Mr. Ralph Scamander, you are suspected of illegally carrying a dangerous magical creature. You are now under arrest by the American Order, thanks to Trooper 1770 for the donation. Chapter 278 Mad Margaret. The young policewoman in black stockings handcuffed Rove with silver bracelets, then fastened his arms behind his back with clean, swift movements. "Madam, I'm a good person. Have you arrested the wrong person?" Rove turned to look at the policewoman, his handsome, unisex face filled with innocence and grievance. "Do I look like someone illegally carrying a magical creature? Look at me, open your eyes wide and look closely. I'm only 13 years old. I'm just a child, but the policewoman didn't even look at his face, instead coldly saying, "Madam doesn't need you to teach her how to do things." She professionally reached into the boy's waist and pockets, while lowering her voice to warn, "Scamander, I'm going to take your wand now, you'd better not move, or I can dislocate your arm with a snap, understand?" This was the first time Rolf had experienced such a service of being grabbed on the spot and subjected to such a rough body search. He couldn't help but laugh. "Excuse me, is this how it dislocates?" The policewoman narrowed her eyes. Before she could understand Rolf's words, she was surprised to find that the boy's elbow joint, which was being held captive, seemed to have suddenly disappeared, going limp. Rolf's body began to rotate strangely around his capsized arm, his wrist twisting at will, more flexible than a severed limb. The policewoman had only ever witnessed such incredible flexibility, defying the limits of human anatomy, in Muggle gymnasts. The situation instantly reversed. Rolf's snake-like body coiled around the policewoman, his hand gripping the girl's delicate, fair neck. Rolf chuckled, staring at the policewoman whose face was obscured, returning the same words, "You'd better not move, or I can snap your neck in a second, understand?" The policewoman blinked, then suddenly raised her right leg, her toes swiftly flicking towards the boy's crotch. Rolf seemed to have anticipated this. He abruptly brought his legs together, trapping the girl's slender, black-stockinged legs, preventing her from delivering the fatal blow. The boy smiled, teasingly saying, "Just a heads up, the guy who did this last time already has a broken leg." The policewoman tried to pull her leg back, but it was firmly trapped, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't free it. She glared fiercely at the boy. Rolf increased his pressure, but not enough to hurt the girl. He chuckled, "Whether you're an Auror or a Muggle policewoman, you're no match for me. Go back and practice before you try to catch me again, or I might mistake you for a magical creature and stuff you into a box." Looks like 2 years at Hogwarts, that bottom-ranked school, has made you more confident. As the policewoman spoke, a tiny, eerie green scorpion, the size of a fingernail, slithered out of her pocket. The girl smiled. "Go on, Alice, entertain this guest from England and bring him to his senses." The scorpion raised its pincers, hissing, and thrust its tail, ending in a dark, hooked stinger, towards the boy. Rolf, seeing the incredibly rare North American green scorpion, said helplessly, "You say I keep dangerous magical creatures? Aren't you dangerous too? A bite from this North American green scorpion, without an antidote, could be fatal." This crazy woman. "Mind your own business." The policewoman's lips curled into a smug smile. Rolf snapped his fingers quickly, and a fireball materialized, condensing into a fire lizard that flew towards the green scorpion. The flames hissed softly, deterring the scorpion from approaching. "Little girl, do you have any more tricks up your sleeve? Show me what you've got," Rolf sneered. The policewoman narrowed her eyes, a dangerous glint in them. Suddenly, she opened her mouth wide and bit down hard on the boy's arm. Margaret, don't go too far," Rolf shouted. "Let go, or I'll knock your teeth out." The policewoman released her mouth after a moment, sticking out her pink tongue and licking her sexy lips, her eyes sparkling as she said, "Serves you right for provoking me." Rolf's arm was marked with teeth marks, but thankfully there was no bleeding. He wiped his drool with disgust and said, "Just like a dog, all you do is bite." Margaret took off her hat, revealing a beautiful oval face. She also had thick, curly blonde hair that danced lightly in the wind, and her gray-blue eyes were bright and piercing. "Rolf, how did you know it was me? Who else would be so bored as to wear a Muggle policewoman uniform and arrest me in the name of an Auror?" Rolf rolled his eyes. He released Margaret's leg, raised the handcuffs, and said, "Hurry up and unlock this thing." Margaret held the key between two fingers. Rolf was about to reach for it when she flicked her finger, tossing the key high into the air before it fell into the river with a splash. Margaret fastened the other half of the handcuffs to her own wrist. The girl giggled. "These are handcuffs specially made with alchemy. There's only one key. Don't expect your botricle to open them." Rolf looked disdainful. He couldn't unlock it without the key? The boy used the harpy magic to shrink part of his arm, but the handcuffs shrunk along with it. Rolf frowned. He turned around, intending to look for the key at the bottom of the river, but Margaret grabbed him. She patted the boy's shoulder and said sweetly, "Don't bother looking. If you can't open it, you can't open it. We can just be conjoined twins for life. With your sister by your side, you won't lose out." Get lost, what a mess. Rolf already regretted coming to America. Wasn't it better to be alone in England? Maybe he should just go back to the Mayflower and go to the Hawaiian Islands with the Fleur sisters to play beach Quidditch. Let's go. Margaret took the boy's arm and led him towards a red pickup truck parked by the roadside. Margaret, I haven't checked the luggage or registered the ones yet, Ralph reminded her. Since the late 19th century, wizards traveling to America had to carry a wand license to prove their identity. Without registration, it was considered a legal entry, and being caught by the Magical Congress was no joke. I know, let's get in first, Margaret said, opening the car door. Handcuffed, Ralph could only follow behind Margaret. Seeing the girl already seated in the driver's seat, he said speechlessly, You got in first, where am I supposed to sit? Margaret patted her black stockinged legs and grinned mischievously, You can sit on my lap, get lost. Margaret got out again, letting Ralph climb into the passenger seat first, then she sat back down. Margaret pressed the clutch, and the pickup truck slowly started moving. Then she slammed on the gas, but instead of heading towards the registered Magic Council wizards, she veered off onto another road, and escaped. Chapter 279 Ralph, this thing is much better than a magic wand. Margaret, with Ralph in tow, floored the gas pedal and sped out of Wizard Harbor, roaring away into the distance, far from the scrutinizing Magical Congress officials. Americans love pickup trucks, and Margaret was no exception, but Ralph's attention wasn't on that, rather, it was on the fact that no one stopped them, and no wizards chased after them, despite their brazen escape, left Ralph utterly bewildered. I'm going to take you on a grand escape down New York Avenue to evade the horrors. Are you scared? Margaret said with a bright smile. Have you been watching too much Hollywood? Ralph rolled his eyes and asked, What's going on? Why isn't anyone stopping us? The answer is in my jacket pocket. You find it yourself. Ralph reached into the side pockets of the policewoman's uniform, but found nothing. Up there, Ralph's eyes darted upwards, near the chest area of Margaret's uniform. There were many small pockets, and he had no choice but to start searching them one by one. Seeing Ralph's cautiousness, Margaret giggled, her laughter almost uncontrollable. After a few moments of fumbling, she asked in a sweet voice, Did you find it? Ralph's cheeks burned. He took a deep breath, ignoring Margaret's question. Fortunately, after some searching and struggling, he finally found a work idea. He pulled it out, opened it, and saw a photograph of Margaret and a striking American Eagle logo, MACUSA. United States of America, Magical Congress. Ralph examined the identification carefully, confirming it wasn't fake. He raised an eyebrow and said, You work at the Magical Congress? Didn't you say before that even dogs don't go to the Magical Congress? I don't want to go either, Margaret yawned listlessly. But Hermione has a rule that all students about to enter 7th year must find a job during the summer break. What kind of job are you doing? Guess. Ralph stared at the work permit, then suddenly had a look of realization. The wand licensing office. No wonder those wizards didn't stop them from checking. They were all Margaret's colleagues, one of their own. Not too stupid after all, Margaret chuckled. Looks like 2 years at Hogwarts hasn't turned you into a complete idiot, Margaret. Hogwarts isn't as bad as you say, Ralph, don't argue with me. What you need to do now is try to please me. Margaret smiled smugly, her eyes narrowing. I'll issue your wand license, and I'll inspect your suitcase. Others might not find anything wrong, but I will. Once I report it, you'll be placed on the Magical Congress's watch list, and you might even be deported. Understand? Ralph seriously suspected that Margaret had deliberately endured the boredom of interning at the wand license office just so she could scrutinize him. Making dumplings for a little jealousy, this crazy woman would do something like that. Is it okay if you just leave like this? It won't count as absenteeism, Ralph asked curiously. Be careful, they might deduct your wages and give you a low score on your internship evaluation. I gave up my days off the past few days to work extra shifts for them, so I'm taking an early day off today, and no one will gossip. Margaret suddenly became angry and said, I didn't have to work overtime, but you didn't arrive on time, which meant I had to wait for you at the dock until late every night these past few days. Having gotten used to being teased by Margaret, Ralph was even a little touched for a moment, and felt a little uncomfortable. This distant cousin, who seemed crazy on the surface, was actually quite nice. But Margaret's next sentence made Ralph take back that assessment. Ralph, how are you going to make it up to me? Margaret winked and said sweetly, How about you be my house elf for the summer, serving me every day? It's okay, I'll allow you to wear clothes. Ralph's cheeks burned. He quickly opened the window, and the breeze sobered him up a bit. The boy explained, "Actually, it has nothing to do with me. It was Captain Carlos of the Mayflower who caused the flight delay. So many things happened along the way, all his fault. He's supposed to have 30 years of piloting experience? I think he's only 3 years old at most." Captain Carlos. Margaret raised her eyebrows, a strange smile suddenly appearing on her face. "Where are we going now?" Ralph watched the pickup truck turn onto Fifth Avenue. "To the Magical Congress of the United States of America," Margaret explained. "Tell my dad I've picked you up. My dad's been nagging me lately about how you don't come home for summer vacation. You're like a son to me." Margaret's father was the head of the Auror office at the Magical Congress, and her mother was the editor-in-chief of the New York Ghost newspaper. Grandma Queenie had retired, and Grandpa Jacob was still running a bakery. "You're going to the Magical Congress in this?" Ralph looked Margaret up and down in her uniform. "Can't we change?" "What's wrong? Doesn't it look good?" Margaret gave a dangerous smile, raising her beautiful eyebrows. "It looks good, but," the boy wanted to say, "it wasn't very proper, especially with the handcuffs on their hands." It looked even stranger. "This is an outfit I specially prepared for you. I thought you liked this style." Margaret looked disappointed. "Why would I like it? I see handcuffs and whips all over the wall of your trunk." "Those are for dealing with magical creatures," Ralph argued. Margaret blinked, smiled sweetly, and beckoned with her finger, saying, "I have nurse uniforms and office lady pencil skirts in my car. Which one do you want to see?" "I'll change you in the car right now." If he weren't already in the car, Rove would have fled in panic. It wasn't that he was shy, but Margaret was too formidable. He couldn't handle this crazy woman at all. "Oh dear, it's only been 2 years, and you're already shy." Margaret suddenly burst into laughter, pointing at Rove with her finger, and said with a playful grin, "Little Rove, what's there to be shy about? When you were little, I always changed your diapers. You were 5 or 6 years old, and you were still wetting the bed. You ran to my bed and insisted on sleeping next to me. Now you're shy. Get lost," Rove said angrily. "Why don't you say that you secretly sprinkled water on it?" Rove had transmigrated and possessed all of his predecessors' memories, including those about Margaret, all painful and unbearable past events. Margaret sprinkled water on his bed to tell everyone that he had wet the bed. She even held him while he peed and flicked his little chin. Margaret taught young Ralph the word poop, pointing to a piece of candy and telling him it was poop, then giving it to him. Ralph eventually pointed to the word poop and told Newt he wanted some. Utterly indecent. Ralph had a natural fear of this crazy woman, mostly stemming from the personal torment he remembered. Ralph ignored Margaret, opening the car cabinet to see if those strange uniforms really existed, and quickly threw them in the trash. For Ralph to see? Wrong. Knowing Margaret as Ralph did, it was more likely she forced the boy to wear those clothes. But unexpectedly, Ralph found a gun in the corner. "Why is there a gun in your car?" the boy asked, bewildered. Margaret, resting her chin on her hand, casually asked, "We students at Evamoni aren't allowed to use ones outside of school, so everyone carries a gun. These things are much more useful than wands. I suggest you get one too. Guns are rampant in America. Getting a gun is easier than getting a wand. You're forbidden from using wands, but you can carry a gun, and it won't violate the secrecy law." Ralph twitched his lips, thinking, that's so typical of Americans. Chapter 280 Avada Kedavra in the left hand, RPG in the right. As the country with the most guns in the world, the United States, with only 4.4% of the world's population, directly contributes 40% of the world's civilian gun ownership. Therefore, rampant gun violence is an absolute chronic problem in the American Muggle world. In the future, there might even be so-called gun sharing, where you can rent a semi-automatic rifle simply by scanning a QR code. If your Amazon credit score is above 700, you can even rent it without a deposit. Whether it's independent travel, free shopping, or withdrawing money from a bank, it's extremely convenient. However, in stark contrast to the Muggle world, the Magical Congress of the United States has extremely strict control over wands, seemingly going to the other extreme. Any wizard traveling to the US must apply for a wand license, and those with criminal records will not be able to obtain one. Years ago, Scamander escorted a Thunderbird to New York, and his wand license application failed. The reason was simple, his file clearly stated, he had been expelled from Hogwarts. Newt, without a license and illegally possessing a dangerous magical creature, also encountered the kind-hearted Tina in New York, and the ever-successful Newt was captivated by her, A double whammy of psychological and physical intrigue. It's not just foreign wizards. The American magical community's control over wands starts from childhood. In other countries, underage wizards are prohibited from casting spells outside of school during holidays, but their wands aren't confiscated. At most, the Ministry of Magic uses tracking wires for monitoring. The US goes even further, requiring students to leave their wands at school during holidays. Even a young wizard's first wand isn't purchased from a store, it's assigned during sorting at Ivory Morney School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Of course, with the repeal of the Rappaport Law, the rule about leaving wands at school completely disappeared, but it remains quite strict. Therefore, in the US, where acquiring guns is easier than acquiring wands, it's not a big problem for young wizards to carry firearms for self-defense, it's just that the US has its own unique circumstances. Ralph didn't pay much attention, he played with his small pistol for a while, preparing to take Margaret's suggestion and go to the countryside with her sometime to practice his marksmanship. These days, mastering both magic and marksmanship is the only way to go. To cultivate martial virtue, you need an Avada Kedavra in your left hand and an RPG in your right. That's the modern wizard's fighting style. At this moment, Pikachu had already entered the famous Broadway and stopped not far from a towering building. Ralph got out of the car and looked at the Gothic-style Woolworth Building. Built in 1913, the Woolworth Building has 30 floors in its main structure, topped by a 30-story narrow tower. Before the Chrysler Building was completed, it was the tallest building in the world. The Woolworth Building is also quite famous among wizards, as the Magical Congress of the United States is located there. Ralph was about to walk towards the building when he turned back and found Margaret hadn't moved. The girl was taking a white slip of paper from her pocket and tucking it into Pikachu's windshield wiper. "What's this?" the boy asked curiously. "A Muggle ticket," Margaret said with a smile. "There's a time limit for parking here. If you stay too long, the Muggle cops will give you a ticket." "Is that possible?" Ralph asked in surprise. "Doesn't the ticket have a time on it?" "It's fine. The ticket has magic on it. It automatically changes the time according to the date," Margaret said proudly. "It also has a confusion charm I cast on it. When they get close, they'll think they've already been ticketed." "I'm so clever, aren't I?" Margaret raised her beautiful eyebrows and said, "I'm planning to mass-produce them and sell them to other wizards." "Isn't that a great business opportunity?" Ralph actually narrowed his eyes and thought about it seriously. He shook his head and said, "It sounds promising, but wizards are only a minority of people who use cars. The potential market is too small. You don't have to worry about that, my little Ralph." Margaret put her arm around Ralph's shoulder. She gently pinched the boy's soft, tender cheek and smiled. "I only need 2,000 pots of startup capital. You can sponsor me some, and we'll earn 70-30. Unlike Britain, the magical currency used in the United States is called a zoot. 2 zots can be exchanged for 1 galleon. 2,000 zots is 1,000 galleons. For Ralph at present, it's not a large sum, but it's not a small amount that can be easily wasted either." Margaret clearly didn't intend to spend time producing the thing. She just proposed a project, made a grand promise, and tried to scam investors out of their money. Anyone who believed her was a troll. "No money, and even if I had money, I wouldn't invest in you," Ralph coldly refused. "I'm going to report you for evading a ticket." "What do you know?" Margaret snorted. "Wizards and the Muggle government in the United States have a grudge. The Purifiers cooperate with them and have been hunting down wizards. Every time I pay a ticket, it could become a bullet fired by the Muggle army at a wizard." "That makes so much sense." Ralph was speechless. The two bickered as they walked towards Woolworth Building. Guards stood at the entrance, one of whom wore a cloak-like uniform, looking out of place among the Muggles. Upon seeing Margaret, the wizard guard, though surprised by her Muggle uniform, immediately opened the door. He recognized the witch. After all, she was so beautiful, it was hard to forget her. But this was the first time he'd seen a witch walking intimately with a boy. It seemed many single men in the Magical Congress would be having a sleepless night. The wizard guard sized up the boy before him and quickly noticed their wrists were handcuffed together. "Hey, young people these days really know how to have fun." Ralph and Margaret stepped through the revolving doors and into the building. What greeted their eyes wasn't Woolworth Hall, but the Great Hall of the Magical Congress of the United States of America. It was a magnificent rectangular hall with 17 vaulted floor-to-ceiling windows on the west wall. Correspondingly, the east wall featured 17 large mirrors made of 483 individual pieces. Standing in the center of the hall, One could admire this lavishly decorated Congress Hall from different angles through the mirrors. On the vaulted ceiling hung a huge, highly artistic oil painting depicting the founding of the Magical Congress and the original 12 Aurors. In the center of the hall, a huge rotating disc, high up, was adorned with gears and dials. The dials were inscribed with the words, Magical Exposure Threat Level. The pointer pointed to Slight. Behind the disc hung a large portrait of an elderly man with white hair, seemingly older than Dumbledore, his face covered in age spots, Anderson D. Fisher, the current president of the Magical Congress. Anderson D. Fisher was the oldest president in the history of the Magical Congress of the United States of America. He had run for president 3 times in nearly half a century, finally seizing the last opportunity 5 years ago, successfully being elected president at the age of 95. However, now 100 years old, Anderson's health was poor, showing signs of dementia. Many wizards doubted whether he could survive the final 2 years of his term. Owls circled and hovered in the hall, a group of wizards lined up at the front desk, and many staff members were attending to them. Margaret led Ralph directly to the elevator. The elevator doors opened, revealing a goblin attendant inside. "Our office," Margaret said softly. "Yes, Miss Kowalski." The goblin poked the elevator button above his head with a long, clawed staff. The elevator ascended smoothly and silently to the top floor. The elevator shaft narrowed, the thick pillars converging into a solid vertical passage. When the doors opened, Ralph and Margaret stepped out, walked down the corridor, and stopped in front of a door with a brass plaque, "Our office, thanks to the generous donation from Just Love to Wander, a tribute to my Harry Potter fanfiction, From Booksputins to Hogwarts, a new book of over 200,000 words. Readers who are interested can check it out." Synopsis: After transferring from Hogwarts to Booksputins, Calvin swore, "Even if I die outside, jump off Booksputins, I will never return to England, never return to Hogwarts." However, 13 years after leaving Hogwarts, Calvin realized how wonderful it was. Hogwarts was great, with its vast library, safe castle, referring to the annual incidents, gentle professors, referring to Snape, and talented people everywhere. He loved being there. Chapter 281: New York Zombies. The Auror office was large, filled with desks separated by partitions to form many small cubicles. About half the desks were empty, probably occupied by missions or meetings. The remaining Aurors were all busy at their respective positions. When Ralph and Margaret re-entered the office, the previously noisy room seemed to be muted, the sound dropping considerably. Everyone knew Margaret, even the newly arrived intern Aurors knew her, not only because she was strikingly beautiful, but also because she was their boss's beloved daughter. To win her over would be like skipping 20 years of hard work. Not only in the Auror office, but even many single male wizards from the neighboring department had their eyes on this delicate rose. But while the rose was beautiful, it bore gleaming thorns. Margaret had many suitors, but so far, no boy had ever been seen getting close to her. Unexpectedly, today they saw her arm in arm with a young man, smiling broadly as she walked into the room. It was heartbreaking. Ralph felt every unfamiliar eye was staring at him, but he often enjoyed this kind of attention at Hogwarts and didn't care at all. "Hey, Margaret," a young witch hurried over. "Mr. Kowalski is in the interrogation room, questioning a prisoner. It's all right, Trish, I'll just wait in his office." Margaret smiled. Trish hummed in agreement, ignoring Margaret's strange attire, and turned curiously to the blonde boy. Suddenly, her face showed surprise, and she said, "Mr. Ralph Scamander?" "Hello." Ralph was somewhat surprised. "You recognize me?" "Yes, your picture is in the Daily Prophet." The witch seemed very excited. She extended her hand and said, "My name is Trish. I've noticed you since Rita Skeeter's story last year. I've been following the recent Black case too. Your keen insight in catching little Pettigrew and helping Black overturn his conviction is truly admirable." Ralph shook her hand and smiled. "I was just lucky." Trish seemed to have been following Ralph for a long time. She chattered on and on, praising him and asking many questions. After a moment, Trish said apologetically, "Sorry, I got a little excited and probably asked too many questions." "It's all right. I heard a great wizard say that a good Auror is always curious about everything." Ralph smiled. He spoke politely, without the slightest impatience, not at all like a 13-year-old boy. Trish led the way, and Margaret leaned close to the boy's ear, her lips just inches from his. She whispered, "Which great wizard said that?" "I just said it," Ralph said in a low voice. Margaret almost burst out laughing. She reached out and pinched the boy's earlobe, saying in a sweet voice, "Next time, just say I said it." Ralph rolled his eyes at Margaret and gently slapped away the girl's slender, white hand. The group walked and talked, and Ralph saw all sorts of prisoners being interrogated by aurors along the way. One of the wizards was the loudest. He shouted indignantly, "Why are you arresting me? I just picked up a rope, and you aurors are arresting people randomly. Is there no law?" "Shut up," a middle-aged wizard scolded. "Why don't you mention that there's a wild unicorn tied to the rope?" Ralph watched with great interest, finding it quite amusing, of course, provided he wasn't the one being interrogated. As the group entered the office, the aurors grew even noisier, all speculating about his identity. Trish made 2 cups of coffee and, not wanting to disturb them any further, tactfully turned and left the room. Ralph sat on the sofa, and Margaret followed, crossing one of her black stockinged legs and placing it on the boy's lap, chuckling, "Not bad, little Ralph, you've already won over a female fan so quickly. When are you planning to take her out on a date?" "Don't talk nonsense, I'm a respectable person." Ralph reached out and grabbed Margaret's restless leg to steady her. He looked up and stared at a blackboard. The blackboard was covered with photos, each one horrifying: a man with twisted lips, lunging at another like a madman, tearing off pieces of flesh and swallowing them whole. Another photo showed a witch grabbing a man and gouging out his eyes. The man screamed, and she bit off his tongue, spitting it out. Each photo was chilling. Margaret followed Ralph's gaze and said softly, "These are the recent attacks. Muggles call them zombies." "Zombies?" Ralph raised an eyebrow. "They suddenly attack people like madmen, like zombies in Muggle movies, but not under a spell." Ralph stared at the photograph, noticing the grayish-white pupils of the people in it, lost in thought. Just then, the door opened, and a large group of wizards entered. At the head was a blonde, middle-aged man with a short beard and a hooked nose. This man was Queenie and Jacob's son, Margaret's father, Host Kowalski. Ralph's grandmother, Tina, and Queenie were sisters, making Host his cousin. Behind Host followed 2 aurors, escorting 2 wizards and a corpse. One of them, a man with dark red hair, was completely bound. His hands trembled violently, and his legs twisted and turned as if performing a grotesque dance. The other wizard, a fat man, looked haggard, with a bandage around his neck, indicating he had been attacked but had survived. The corpse was wrapped in white cloth, obscuring its features. "Ralph, you're back. It's so good to see you." Horst strode over, grabbed him, and nearly broke his bones. He scrutinized the boy from head to toe, then laughed loudly. "You've grown so much taller." Ralph smiled shyly. "Uncle, long time no see, I'll talk to you later. I'm going to issue some missions." Horst strode out of the office. Besides Ralph and Margaret, only 2 aurors remained in the room, guarding the bound, maroon-haired man to prevent him from breaking free and attacking others. A fat man, one of the victims, coughed and said, "Sir, I'm thirsty. Could I have some water?" The young auror hesitated, glancing at the maroon-haired prisoner. His companion whispered, "It's all right, this guy's tied up. I can keep an eye on him." The young auror nodded slightly and strode out of the room, leaving only one auror to watch the prisoner and prevent any unusual movements. The auror's entire attention was focused on the prisoner when, suddenly, the fat wizard pounced on him from behind like a cheetah. Caught off guard, the auror fell to the ground, and the fat wizard pounced on him, biting down hard on his shoulder, drawing blood. The fat wizard tried to continue devouring the auror, but a long, thin vine shot out, wrapping around his neck and pulling him backward. The fat wizard reached into the vine around his neck, arching his hips back, trying to break free. But the cold vine tightened, and the fat wizard immediately abandoned the auror, rising and rushing towards Ralph and Margaret in the direction the vine was pulling. Margaret raised her wand and shouted, "Conviction!" The spell struck the fat wizard's head, but he didn't lose consciousness. Ralph frowned, snapped his fingers, and vines sprouted from his box, like shackles, instantly binding the fat wizard's arms and ankles, rendering him immobile. The boy slowly walked over, staring into the fat wizard's eyes, then approached the corpse covered by a white sheet. When the aurors rushed into the office, they saw the blonde boy, whom everyone had just unanimously considered a pretty boy, squatting beside the mangled corpse, carefully examining it. This scene sent chills down everyone's spine. Ralph looked up at the crowd, then pointed to the corpse, calmly saying, "Poisoned." Chapter 282 Margaret, "Ralph, I'll give you a checkup tonight." When Horst returned to his office, He found the doorway crowded with aurors, all peering inside. He frowned and asked, "What happened, Master?" "That fat man named Flint suddenly attacked Rom," a dark-skinned wizard explained. "This, young gentleman, he subdued Flint and saved Rom." Horst looked up and saw Ralph tending to Rom's bitten wounds, with Margaret standing beside him, carrying his black leather suitcase. Not far away, Flint was bound by vines, his mouth full of blood, his face contorted, and his body convulsing violently. His symptoms were the same as the man with the maroon hair. Both had been infected with what Muggles called zombie poison. "Uncle, Flint was bitten, and his blood is also poisonous," Ralph said, looking up. "You should restrain him." "Nonsense, poison doesn't spread through bites," said a pale, thin young wizard, his voice somewhere between a sneer and a mutter. "Children shouldn't talk nonsense if they don't understand." Ralph raised an eyebrow, glancing out of the corner of his eye at his sister Margaret, who was about to retort. The boy patted her arm, then stood up, maintaining a calm and polite tone, and asked, "May I ask who you are?" "Elisa Thorne." "Very well, Mr. Thorne, so you know a lot, huh?" Ralph said with a smile. "Then could you please tell me, what kind of poison is this?" The young wizard was momentarily speechless. He paused, then sneered, "I don't know, but I know you're talking nonsense." "How so?" "We've rescued many wizards who were bitten, and they're all perfectly normal, showing no signs of poisoning or attacking others," Thorne exclaimed sharply. "Clearly, Flint wasn't poisoned because of the bite. It must have been another wizard who poisoned him." "I thought you had some brilliant insight. Is that all?" Ralph's half-smile revealed his disdain for Thorne's words. "Talking about toxicity without considering dosage is just being irresponsible. The wizards you encountered who were bitten didn't show obvious symptoms because the dosage was too small. But that doesn't mean they weren't poisoned. Just like if you were bitten by a bamboo viper and didn't die, does that mean it's a mildly venomous snake?" Ralph scoffed. "Toxicity is determined by the median lethal dose, LD 50. The bamboo viper is highly venomous, but its venom output is very low, only a few milligrams per bite, so most people won't die from it." "You don't even understand such a simple principle? What did you learn in the protection of magical creatures class?" Ralph sighed. "With your level, can you even become an Auror?" "I'm an apprentice Auror," Margaret added at the opportune moment. "Whether I can become a full Auror is another matter." "Oh, that puts my mind at ease," Ralph said sarcastically, his tone bitter. "I advise you to come to Hogwarts and brush up on your protection of magical creatures class as soon as possible, otherwise it'll be difficult for you to become a full Auror." Thorne's face turned red with anger, and he shouted, "Who knows if you're just talking nonsense? Sorry, the conclusion that this toxin can be transmitted through bites wasn't my statement, it was my grandfather's." Ralph shrugged. "And who is this nobody, your grandfather?" Margaret laughed heartily, putting her arm around Ralph's shoulder, and said, "His grandfather is Newt Scamander." Thorne. Everyone suddenly realized why this young man was so confident. It turned out to be the famous Scamander. Now there was a reason to believe him. "My grandfather isn't really that famous," Ralph blinked and said, "but Mr. Thorne, since you believe that being bitten won't cause poisoning, how about we make a bet? Let the patient bite you a few times, and I'll give you 1,000 gallons for each bite. Anyway, you won't die, isn't that a good deal?" Thorne's face turned pale. He really didn't dare to accept this bet. "All right." Seeing the situation was about to spiral out of control, Horst interrupted the argument, walked over, and asked, "Rolf, so do you know what kind of poison this is?" The Auror office had been investigating this matter recently, but they had no clue whatsoever and couldn't find the source of the poison. "This poison comes from the blue-eyed toad, a magical creature unique to Columbia," Rolf explained. "The toad secretes the toxin on its skin that causes hallucinations and euphoria. Local indigenous wizards have a tradition of licking this toxin to induce hallucinations." Rolf and Newt had seen this magical creature when they traveled to Columbia, but Newt hadn't recorded it in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. The reason was simple: this toad is only found in a small area, and if he recorded it, he was afraid other wizards would hunt it, or even breed and abuse it on a large scale. Like now. If it's just licking the toad's skin, the intake wouldn't be much, and it wouldn't attack anyone else, Rove continued. It must be that someone extracted the toxin and injected it into the wizard's body. This large dose would drive the wizard mad, causing them to attack those around them, and greatly increasing their physical tolerance, such as pain tolerance. Even if their arm were cut off, they wouldn't feel pain. It could only have been done by the purifiers, Horst said seriously. "Can you provide any other clues?" Rove thought for a moment and said, These toads live near volcanoes and feed on lava. I suggest investigating the volcano closest to New York. Horst rubbed his temples and shouted, "Didn't you hear me? Move out immediately." Everyone had left, and Horst patted Rove on the shoulder, saying, "I didn't expect you to solve such a big problem as soon as you arrived." Rove said modestly, "Even if I wasn't here, you would definitely have discovered the problem quickly, but more people might die," Horst cautioned. "Rove, go home for dinner tonight, and don't run around with Margaret, understand?" "Yes, I know," Rove nodded quickly. Horst smiled with satisfaction. He liked honest kids like Ralph. They seemed reliable and wouldn't do anything outrageous. "As for you," Horst said, turning to Margaret. His smile vanished instantly. "What are you wearing? Change it right now, and these handcuffs, what are you trying to do with Ralph? As his older sister, you should act like one. Don't lead him astray." After Horst walked away, Margaret exclaimed, "Whose father is he anyway? I feel like he treats you better." Ralph smiled without answering. Margaret tapped the boy's forehead hard with her fingers and whispered, "Serves you right for smiling." "Margaret, why is that thorn targeting me?" Ralph rubbed his head. "Is it related to you? He's been pursuing me, and I rejected him, so he's jealous of you." Margaret sneered. "Oh, I see. Did he pester you relentlessly?" Ralph asked. "Should I break 3 of his legs for you? Give him a warning, little Ralph's all grown up. He can protect his sister now." Margaret put her arm around Ralph's shoulder and grinned. "Tonight, I'll check your physical development, okay? Let's see if you're really that amazing. Let's go home." Margaret tossed the car keys to the boy. "You can drive later, huh?" Ralph took the keys. "I don't have a driver's license." "It's okay," Margaret yawned. "Neither do I." Chapter 283. I'm a police officer, hands up. New York, Queens, Kowalski's Bakery. As dusk fell, the last rays of the setting sun cast a hazy red glow over the bakery, which had been in business for over half a century. A pickup truck sped by, then suddenly slowed, its tires screeching and kicking up a cloud of dust. Rove jumped out, Margaret close behind. She turned and asked, "Did you shake off that policewoman who was chasing us?" "I think so." Rove crossed his arms to calm his racing heart. He hadn't expected to be chased by the police on his very first day in America. It was all Margaret's fault. She'd encouraged Rove to drive without a license, and somehow the young man had believed her and actually driven. But could you trust this crazy woman? They had just crossed a Queens Bridge and were waiting at a traffic light when they encountered a patrolling policewoman. Margaret, sitting in the passenger seat, suddenly yelled at the policewoman that Rove was driving without a license and claimed she had been kidnapped. Rove was stunned, and the policewoman was clearly stunned too. It was probably the first time she'd seen anything like this in all her years on the job. After a long pause, the policewoman got on her motorcycle and gave chase. Rove was indeed a minor driving without a license, and seeing the policewoman chasing after him, he had no choice but to floor the gas pedal and speed away. Although the boy was a skilled driver, he wasn't familiar with the roads, and after a long, winding ride, he finally managed to shake off the guy. "I've been wanting to experience being chased by a muggle cop for ages," Margaret said contentedly. "That was awesome, awesome my foot," Rove cursed. "If I ever believe you again. I'm a dog, alright, don't be angry, little Rove." Margaret reached out and lifted Rove's chin, her voice alluring. "As an apology, I'll put on a show for you to relieve your pent-up frustration tonight. Get lost." Rove didn't believe her a second. After calming themselves down, the two headed towards Kowalski's Bakery, the enticing aroma of hot bread wafting from within. Kowalski's Bakery was owned by Margaret's grandfather, Jacob. Jacob was practically a chosen muggle. Not only did he become best friends with Newt, but he also married the beautiful Queenie. He even fought against Grindelwald as a muggle, obtained a wand, and had breakfast with the students in Hogwarts Great Hall. He had practically achieved every muggle's ultimate dream. Ralph and Margaret entered the shop and saw many customers. The shelves were overflowing with various foods: blueberry jam cookies, cream bread, millefeuille, loaves of bread, lemon cake sprinkled with icing sugar. Most of the local residents had bought bread from the bakery since childhood, and even now, as adults, they still came. The shop employed several girls as employees. Jacob loved baking, but now, at over 90 years old, he could no longer do the work. Margaret led Rove straight upstairs to a large living room. A pen was automatically drawing patterns for clothes on paper, an iron was working in the corner, pressing a skirt, a clothes rack was clumsily spinning automatically in front of the fireplace. Magazines were scattered throughout the room, The Witch's Friend, The Witch's Whispers, and The New York Ghost. The magic radio was blaring, it was news time, and the announcer's melodious, sweet voice echoed throughout the room. "Grandpa, Grandma," Margaret called out, "look who I brought." Rove followed Margaret to the balcony, where they saw the two elderly people sitting and admiring the sunset. Queenie was quite old, her once golden hair had turned gray, but her clothes were still fashionable and beautiful, and she exuded a faint scent of rose perfume. Queenie grasped Ralph's wrist with her weathered hands. "Child, it's so good to see you." Before Ralph could speak, Queenie's eyes, gleaming like polished jewels, shone brightly across her wrinkled face. She already knew what the boy was thinking. "Yes, I am indeed old, my hair is falling out in clumps. Getting old is really hard," the witch said with a kind smile. Queenie was a natural legilimency master, she could see through other people's emotions and thoughts without any learning. "No, Grandma is always so beautiful," Ralph said respectfully, kissing Queenie's cheek. Hearing Margaret's voice, Jacob opened his eyes filled with joy. Ralph, my little Ralph, Jacob, tall and robust in his youth, had become somewhat bloated in his old age. A trembling smile appeared on his face as he said, "You haven't come back to see me for so long since you went to Hogwarts." "I'm sorry, Grandpa," Ralph said, grasping the old man's arm. "I'm back now, aren't I? I brought you a gift, and a letter from Professor Dumbledore." "Oh, how is Albus?" Jacob asked, somewhat pleased. "He's fine." Queenie clearly looked much healthier than Jacob, which was normal. Wizards could live to be 100 or 200 years old. But for Muggles, 100-year-old was already nearing the end of their lives. Ralph couldn't help but marvel at the power of time. After chatting with the two elderly people for a while, the boy followed Margaret up to the third floor. After Margaret arrived in her room, she kicked off her shoes, plopped down on the bed, took off her black stockings, revealing two bright, white, tender thighs, and draped them over Ralph's shoulders. "I'm exhausted today." Ralph glanced at the two delicate, alabaster-like feet on his shoulder and said helplessly, "Margaret, can't you be a little more mindful of your image?" "I never deliberately hide my beauty," Margaret said with a flirtatious smile, striking a seductive pose. "Besides, aren't you the only one here?" Margaret then reached out and unbuttoned the top button of her policewoman uniform. "The second one." "The third one." Ralph jumped in surprise. "What are you doing, changing clothes?" Margaret winked. "I can't keep wearing this uniform, can I?" "What, you don't want me to change out of my police uniform? I told you you like this style, but you won't admit it." "Who likes it?" Ralph frowned. "Let's figure out how to open these handcuffs." "I can't sleep here every night, can I?" "I don't mind," Margaret laughed. "I told you, we'll be conjoined twins from now on." "All right, I won't tease you anymore," Margaret laughed heartily. She pulled open her collar and pulled out a key from her smooth breasts, tossing it to the boy. Ralph quickly picked up the warm key and unlocked the handcuffs. He breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm going to take a shower. We can go together, okay?" Margaret winked. Ralph fled in panic, quickly leaving Margaret's room. "Coward," Margaret laughed and scolded. After leaving the room, Ralph sat on the living room sofa, examining the alchemical handcuffs. They were actually quite interesting. Just then, hurried footsteps came from the stairs. Ralph assumed it was Queenie coming up. So he turned to see a policewoman enter. It was the same one who had just chased them. The policewoman raised her wand. "I'm a police officer, put your hands up." These days, wizards use guns, and police use wands? What kind of fantasy world is this? The witch shouted, "Margaret, are you alright? Hey, were you really kidnapped? Cough twice if you're not dead." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 284 I am a good person. The witch called out Margaret's name, and Ralph breathed a sigh of relief. It turned out that the policewoman who had been chasing him was one of his own. Damn Margaret, why didn't she say so sooner? She made him worry for nothing. Rove stood up, a faint smile on his face. "Miss, please forgive me, but I'm Margaret's brother." "She wasn't kidnapped, she's just joking with you." "Nonsense. I've known her for years and have never heard of her having a brother," the policewoman scoffed. Grandma Queenie only had one son. I told you not to move. I just got bitten by a mosquito and am scratching it. Rove raised his hand, signaling the witch to relax. He narrowed his eyes and smiled confidently. Miss, do I look like a bad guy? There are plenty of good-looking but treacherous wizards out there, the policewoman sneered. Don't try that on me, it won't work. I hate men who are prettier than girls. Rove was stunned, both amused and exasperated. This was the first time he'd met such a strange girl. Where had Margaret met this chick? But then again, wasn't it perfectly normal for a friend of Margaret's to not be a normal person? Miss, I apologize for my good looks. Ralph bowed slightly and smiled. But it's not my fault. It's my parents who passed on their excellent genes to me. It's all their fault, smooth talker. You look even less like a good person now. The policewoman's vigilance increased. Where's Margaret? Margaret is taking a bath. I can't exactly drag her out of the bathroom to prove my innocence to you. Ralph sighed helplessly. My grandmother and her grandmother are sisters. Although we're not that closely related by blood, we're definitely siblings. I go to Hogwarts. It's normal that you don't recognize me. The policewoman frowned. Speaking of which, she seemed to have heard Margaret mention something about going to Hogwarts. But it had been so long, she couldn't remember clearly. The policewoman had only been lost in thought for a moment when she noticed the boy walking straight towards her. The girl was startled and was about to cast a spell when she heard a shrill, piercing scream, like that of a harbinger of evil. The voice was plaintive and mournful, a wailing lament that filled the witch with nausea and fear. The witch shook her head violently, and when she recovered from the shock, the boy was already standing before her. Ralph grabbed the witch's arm, and without any apparent effort, hoisted her onto his shoulder and slammed her onto the sofa with an over-the-shoulder throw. Ralph went over, handcuffed Margaret to the witch's arms, then pulled out her wand and pointed it at her head. The witch was bewildered. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? Miss, Ralph sat on the sofa, calm and composed, smiling slightly. When dealing with criminals, never lose focus. Keep your eyes fixed on them, or you'll be in trouble sooner or later, whether you're facing a wizard or a muggle. Not long ago, I suggested one of your Hermione students go to Hogwarts to take a course on the protection of magical creatures. Ralph twirled the witch's wand, lowering his voice and clicking his tongue in delight. Now I suggest you come to our school for the world's best and most authentic defense against the dark arts. You and Margaret, you two are truly friends, both dressed in police uniforms, pretending to be policewomen. What kind of fetish do you two have? Ralph touched the witch's badge, laughing. You know, it's quite realistic. Where did you get these cosplay outfits? This quality must have been expensive, right? This is real, the witch shrieked. Margaret's uniform is borrowed from me. At that moment, the door opened, and Margaret, having finished her bath, wearing a white bathrobe and slippers, asked curiously, "What's going on, Ralph? It's so noisy. What are you doing?" The policewoman shouted as soon as she saw Margaret, then burst into sobs. Ralph, let Margaret go right now, Margaret said. I told her I'm your brother, but she didn't believe me and even pointed her wand at me. Ralph explained as he unlocked the policewoman's handcuffs. I had to subdue her first. After all, wands are too dangerous. They can easily go off. Margaret went over and hugged Margaret, who was trembling and sobbing. Margaret, this guy bullied me. Haha, it's all a misunderstanding. Ralph laughed it off and quickly returned the wand to Margaret. Margaret, okay, stop crying. He really is my brother, Margaret introduced. Ralph, she's my roommate in Hermione, and also my best friend. Hello, my name is Ralph Scamander. Ralph hesitated for a moment, then said, a good person. Margaret's tears were about to fall again, and Margaret quickly reached out and patted her shoulder, then glared at Ralph. Margaret comforted Margaret, and Ralph listened for a while before understanding that Margaret was also interning, but as a police officer. Margaret's police uniform was indeed borrowed from Margaret, and the two were about the same height. I'm going to change, you can continue chatting here, Margaret said, getting up. Ralph, you can talk to Margaret about the Mayflower and Captain Carlos. What's there to talk about? Ralph asked curiously. Margaret is Captain Carlos's granddaughter. Margaret winked. Damn it. He made that guy's granddaughter cry. Carlos will definitely give him a hard time if he wants a free ride on the Mayflower again. Ralph suddenly remembered that Carlos had talked about his granddaughter with him many times, praising her like a flower, and even wanting to introduce her to him. Carlos wasn't wrong about one thing, His granddaughter didn't look like him, but she wasn't particularly beautiful either. Luckily, Ralph hadn't been drugged and agreed. That old bastard is always trying to trick people. After changing her clothes, Margaret came out of her room. She found Ralph on the balcony and asked curiously, "Where's Michaelat's?" She went downstairs to chat with Grandma. Ralph looked up at the sky and said, "Margaret, you've really gotten yourself into trouble this time. How would I know you defeated her in one move?" "Michaelat's score in defense against the dark arts is quite good," Margaret asked curiously. "Are all the students at Hogwarts as strong as you?" "Probably no one is stronger than me," Ralph said softly. "I thought sacrificing a defense against the dark arts professor would actually improve students' grades," Margaret laughed. "By the way, could you teach me that joint-bending magic, that requires flexibility training from a young age?" Ralph glanced at Margaret and said, "I'm afraid you can't." "What?" Margaret glared at him. "Are you saying I'm too old?" "I didn't say that," Ralph shook his head. He thought to himself, even Sherry thought Gabrielle was too old. In the little girl's eyes, Margaret, who was a year older than Fleur, was probably indeed an old auntie. Chapter 285 Margaret, "Ralph, do you need me to help you train Sherry?" Ralph and Margaret didn't chat for long before returning to the second floor, as Margaret's mother, Alessa, had come home. Alessa was a witch of medium build, plain-looking but warm and talkative, and most importantly, she was a normal person. In short, completely different from her beautiful, mad daughter. Alessa liked Ralph very much and chatted with him about many recent events. As the editor of the New York Post, due to her professional habits, she inevitably brought up the black case. "Doesn't the British Ministry of Magic intend to execute Peter Pettigrew?" Alessa handed Ralph a washed apple and asked. "He's a Death Eater who's been on the run for 12 years, so dangerous?" "The British Ministry of Magic hardly ever executes anyone," Ralph thanked her and said softly. "They trust Azkaban and Dementors more." Similar to the Muggle world, the Wizarding world is divided into those who advocate for the death penalty and those who oppose it. The abolitionists, as the name suggests, are dedicated to promoting the abolition of the death penalty in judicial practice, and Wizengamot at the British Ministry of Magic belongs to the abolitionists. If Voldemort were ever caught, he probably wouldn't be executed, but rather imprisoned for life like Grindelwald. The American Wizarding world is different. For serious crimes, they are killed without hesitation, leaving no room for leniency. When Newt came to New York alone, he was sentenced to death. Of course, Grindelwald's own emotional factors played a significant role. Newt and Dumbledore were too close, too intimate to the point of exceeding the normal teacher-student relationship. At least, that's how Grindelwald saw it. Therefore, Grindelwald, disguised as the director of magical law enforcement, Grevis, sentenced Newt to death without a second thought. "Are Dementors really reliable?" Margaret asked curiously. "I heard from Dad that some members of the U.S. Congress have proposed introducing them." "Unreliable?" Ralph said bluntly. "Dementors feed on human emotions. Whoever can truly satisfy them will be their allies. It's their instinct, the most basic principle. The Ministry of Magic imprisoning criminals in Azkaban is like providing food for the Dementors, but that food is far from enough to satisfy them, let alone allow them to reproduce. Once a powerful force appears and makes promises, the Dementors will definitely betray them immediately." In the original timeline, the Dementors collectively turned against Voldemort. Of course, despite all the problems with Dementors, Ralph really wanted to raise one. After all, who could resist a cute, kissing black-robed monster? Just then, footsteps came from the stairs. "Dad's home," Margaret called out. Soon, Horst entered the room, his robes riddled with holes, looking travel-worn. "That was a tough night," Horst grumbled as he sat down in a chair. "We searched all the way to Mount Rainier in Washington. Did you find anything?" Ralph asked. "Quite a few wizards and blue-eyed toads." "Ralph, you really helped out tonight," Horst said excitedly. He quickly recounted what had happened that night. The blue-eyed toads were indeed being raised by the purifiers, who were trying to use their toxins to make wizards attack others, thus exposing the magical world. Horst had captured quite a few purifiers, but some had escaped. Soon it was time for dinner, and it was a lavish meal: roasted bison leg with leeks, venison pie stuffed with carrots, bacon, and mushrooms, lamb chops with honey and cloves, and chilled fruit soup. Queenie had also brought out a jug of chilled wine, and everyone had a small glass. After dinner, the group chatted by the fireplace for a while, and it wasn't until Alessa urged them several times that the family gathering finally ended, and everyone went back to their rooms. Rove slept next to Margaret. He had lived there as a child, and several years had passed. The room was still there for him, and the furnishings were basically unchanged. After taking a shower, Rove climbed into the trunk and sat at the table, but soon he heard footsteps. The boy didn't need to look to know who it was. After all, no one else would be visiting his room so late at night except Margaret. Rove looked up, and sure enough, it was Margaret. She was wearing a purple lace-trimmed nightgown and slippers, her two fair legs swaying under the empty hem of the dress. Ralph glanced at the pleasingly beautiful legs and asked, "What are you doing here in the middle of the night?" "Checking out my little brother's nightlife, to see how rich it is." Margaret walked down the stairs, glanced down at the table, and said speechlessly, "Really? You're doing your potions homework here in the middle of the night? What else could I be doing? You can play games in my room." Margaret leaned half her body on the boy's shoulder, blinking. "I bought a lot of toys. There's bound to be one you like." Ralph rolled his eyes. Margaret even borrowed that police uniform. She wouldn't buy any toys. Besides, if she did have toys, they'd be for playing with Ralph. When they were little, Margaret's favorite game was to lure Ralph to her room, tie him to the bed, take off his shirt, and draw Sniffle on his back. "If you're so free, help me with my history of magic homework." Ralph pulled out a few sheets of parchment from a stack of homework. "I won't even write for myself. Why would I write for you?" Margaret grabbed Ralph's ear and sneered. "What are you thinking, you little rascal?" Margaret looked around the room suspiciously. "The room is much bigger than before, and the furnishings, you definitely didn't arrange them." "Why not me? I've been here before. It used to be like a doghouse." Margaret picked up a celadon vase on the table, which contained lotus flowers that had been enchanted to keep blooming. She sniffed it and smiled. "Such a skillful thing. You could have done it." "Well, it was my assistant," Ralph said somewhat proudly. "I hired a little assistant at Hogwarts. Boy or girl?" "Definitely a girl." Margaret paused for a moment, then suddenly kicked off her slippers, jumped onto the single bed, rolled around and screamed, but in the blink of an eye she quieted down and became a dignified lady. Margaret lay on her side on the bed, propping her head up with one hand, feigning a pitiful, hurt expression. In a soft, plaintive voice, she said, "Little Rov, you have a girlfriend now. Don't you want your sister anymore?" "Don't talk nonsense. Sherry is just my assistant." Rov shook his head. "I hired her to take care of those magical creatures." "To take care of the magical creatures, or to take care of you?" Margaret grinned, then extended a slender finger, straightened her nightgown, ruffled her hair, and gently lifted her nightgown, striking an alluring pose. She asked, "Is that girl named Sherry prettier than me?" Rov didn't answer. Margaret's eyes gleamed as she stared into the boy's eyes. "A girl with a red ponytail. I must say, she's quite pretty, just a bit thin, definitely no breasts." Rov quickly closed his eyes, saying, "Didn't you say you wouldn't look at other people's memories?" Inheriting Queenie's magical talent, Margaret was also a natural-born legilimency master. She couldn't turn off legatoning, and could see everyone's thoughts indiscriminately, whether good, bad, malicious, or kind. Because of the torment this ability caused Margaret to become somewhat neurotic and appear erratic. However, after joining Ifimoni, she learned how to control legatoning and rarely sought to see other people's thoughts anymore. "Sister's just curious." Margaret winked and laughed. "Want me to help you train that girl named Sherry? Look how well I've trained Mikarats. Give me a break." "Do you think you can train Sherry to be as crazy as you?" Ralph said speechlessly. "If you ever go to Hogwarts, you'd better behave yourself and not tarnish my glorious image in front of my friends, you heartless bastard." Margaret laughed and scolded. "Now that you have a pretty little assistant, you're starting to look down on your sister. Hurry up and go back, it's late." Ralph closed his book and said softly, "I'm going to sleep." Margaret lifted the covers and curled up in bed. She laughed. "I'm sleeping here tonight. Want to sleep with me?" "Sleep with me, my foot." Ralph stood up and said, "You stay here, I'll go to your room to sleep." "Go ahead." Margaret pulled the covers tighter around her and laughed. "Good night. Tomorrow morning, I'll bring Grandma to my room to wait for you. We'll say you climbed into my bed in the middle of the night." What? Chapter 286 Thunderbird Sanctuary. If Rove really went to sleep in Margaret's bed, given that woman's erratic personality, she was absolutely capable of doing something like dragging Queenie to block the bed. Then Rove would be sniffing into the vault. Even if he wasn't a thief, he'd still be a thief. Therefore, To avoid having his 3 legs broken, he decided to stay obediently in his room. But letting Margaret sleep in his trunk was clearly not a good idea either. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, Margaret climbed out, woke Rove with her hands, and dragged him to the top of the Statue of Liberty to watch the sunrise. After sunrise, she dragged him to the beach, even bringing a surfboard, trying to teach Rove to surf. But unfortunately, Rove's brain learned, but his hands and feet didn't. He swallowed a lot of seawater, and in frustration, he went to catch razor clams on the beach. If digging for clams relied on luck, then catching razor clams required some skill. As a professional beachcomber, Ralph first peeled away a layer of sand with his hands, then poured some milky white salt into the small hole. Water would spray out of the hole, and then long, thick razor clams would emerge. During the capture, Ralph also received a mission from the system to capture a king clam, ultimately gaining the skill of spraying water, the effect of which was spraying water straight and far. One could say that having this skill as a backup when he's old will prevent him from wetting his shoes with the wind. Margaret dragged Ralph along, and they went on a crazy spree in New York for several days. During this time, he even became an apprentice at a bakery, learning how to bake from Jacob. Once he learned, Ralph could buy an oven and make his own cakes. In this magical world, having more skills is never a bad thing. Ralph stayed in New York for a week before saying goodbye to Margaret and her family, preparing to head to Arizona, the Thunderbird Sanctuary. He was going to find Newt and Tina. Newt owns properties almost all over the world, but his houses are all located in remote areas, either in primeval forests or within various magical animal sanctuaries. They don't have much appreciation value. Newt owns a house in the Thunderbird Sanctuary in Arizona, where he's recently been enjoying some alone time with Tina, and incidentally, studying the Thunderbirds. But the Thunderbird Sanctuary isn't a place wizards can just go anywhere they want. Like the Dragon Sanctuary in Romania, it suffers from serious poaching for years, and the Magical Congress has implemented strict entry and exit measures to protect the Thunderbirds. To enter the sanctuary, one must first apply to the Magical Congress. Similar to a want permit, applicants must have no criminal record, especially no record of trafficking or smuggling magical creatures. As a model student, Ralph certainly wouldn't do such illegal things, and besides, the Scamander family has an excellent reputation in the magical world, known for their honesty and integrity. Well, having connections in Congress is the main reason Ralph got approved smoothly. Otherwise, just the Scamander name alone would have been enough for the staff to hold meetings for days. Standing before the fireplace, Rove, carrying his black leather suitcase, waved goodbye to Queenie and Jacob, saying, "Thank you all for your care." "Goodbye." Rove pinched a pinch of glittering powder and tossed it into the flames. With a whoosh, the fire turned emerald green. He walked straight into the fire, shouting, "Thunderbird Sanctuary, Arizona." Rove's body was engulfed by the flames. He felt as if he had been sucked into a giant electrical outlet, his body spinning rapidly. Accompanied by a deafening roar, Rove saw a series of fireplace doors flash by blurry. When he landed, he was standing in front of a spacious fireplace. It was a small, open-air plaza, bustling with people, including many tourists. In the center of the plaza was a red brick fountain, the water smelling of rust. In the center of the fountain was a huge bronze Thunderbird statue, over 20 meters tall. Between the Thunderbird's claws were 2 crossed lightning bolts and a huge dark cloud. Ralph weaved through the crowd, ascending the marble steps. At a corner, he saw a statue of a young wizard carrying a black box. Ralph stopped to look, a smile creeping onto his face. "This is a statue of Mr. Newt Scamander," a guide explained to the wizard. The Magical Congress erected this statue to commemorate and honor Mr. Scamander for rescuing a Thunderbird from Egyptian smugglers and bringing it all the way back to America. Below the statue was a large stone tablet bearing a protection decree signed by former President of the Magical Congress of the United States, Serafina Pickery, designating the Thunderbird as a protected species. In fact, the establishment of the entire Thunderbird Sanctuary was largely driven by Newt. In those days, few others besides him cared for endangered magical creatures. Ralph gazed at the statue for a while when suddenly a pair of slender hands rested on his shoulders, encircling the boy's neck. A familiar voice rang out. "Little Ralph, hurry up and go." "What are you doing here?" Ralph turned around and saw a blonde girl behind him. He exclaimed in surprise, "Margaret, you? What are you doing here?" "I'm here to protect you. I'm worried about a young wizard like you venturing alone into the dangerous Thunderbird Sanctuary." Margaret blinked and smiled. "Weren't you touched? You were so excited when we said goodbye, crying and hugging each other." Ralph was speechless. This crazy woman was a true performer. Margaret laughed heartily, then leaned close to Ralph with her alluring face, her breath sweet as orchids, and hummed, "That's why I said you're heartless. I was so heartbroken, and you just left without looking back." "Don't you have a job anymore?" Ralph asked curiously. "Just an internship. I already quit," Margaret stretched and said nonchalantly. "I was already tired of that job. In fact, if it weren't for waiting for Ralph at the port, she wouldn't have applied for that position at all. I'm an intern reporter for the New York Post now." Margaret pulled out a camera from somewhere and snapped a picture of Ralph. "I'm here on assignment too." Margaret narrowed her eyes, smiling like a vixen. "I'm here on behalf of the New York Post specifically to interview you, Mr. Scamander, about the black ace, and how you discovered a blue-eyed toad, helping the Aurors thwart the Purifier's conspiracy. You won't refuse me, will you?" "Do you get paid for the interview?" Ralph asked. "I'm somewhat famous now, not just any Tom, Dick, or Harry can be interviewed." "Who are you calling a Tom, Dick, or Harry?" Margaret grabbed Ralph's ear and tugged it gently. "You've grown up all over, and you're getting bolder and bolder. I wasn't talking about you, but I can't let you interview me for free." "Can I?" Ralph quickly said. "You've really grown up, huh? You even know how to use the unspoken rules on a lowly reporter like me." Margaret feigned a resentful look, reaching out to pinch the boy's increasingly angular face, saying, "But if it were you, get lost." Chapter 287 Native Americans. The entrance to the Thunderbird Sanctuary is a Baroque-style building nestled against the mountainside, its exterior simple and elegant, its overall dark red color harmonizing with the natural environment. However, the walls are covered in Thunderbird droppings, like a thick blanket. Rove had only been here once, many years ago, and didn't have a strong impression of the sanctuary. Margaret, however, had been visiting frequently lately, often to see Newt and Tina. Therefore, she handled all the formalities with ease, requiring no effort from Rove, and they even rented a jeep. Once the jeep plunged into the vast, desolate desert, Rove quickly understood why Margaret had rented a car instead of riding a flying broomstick. It was too hot. Arizona has a subtropical continental arid and semi-arid climate, surrounded by desert, with temperatures reaching nearly 50 degrees Celsius. It's practically a furnace. Even inside the car, the heat wave was intense, like being given a warm bear hug by a runner radiating heat. It was incredibly humid and sticky. In this environment, let alone riding a flying broomstick, even standing outside for a few minutes would likely cause dehydration. The wizards at the entrance to the protected area are aware of this, and therefore provide visitors with Muggle transportation. However, with Ralph around, there's no need to worry about the heat. He possesses the magic frost power from Caberlong, which allows him to lower the temperature inside the vehicle by consuming magical energy. In short, Ralph is currently a walking air conditioner. With a heat problem solved, sun protection is still a concern. With such intense ultraviolet radiation, without sun protection, one would turn into an African in just a few days. Margaret is experienced in this area. Sitting in the passenger seat, she poured some sunscreen onto her fingertips and gently applied it to her slender, beautiful legs. From thighs to calves, even her fair, tender toes were not spared. After applying the sunscreen, Margaret handed the bottle back, saying sweetly, "Rolf, help me apply sunscreen. I can't reach my back." "You're wearing clothes. Why are you applying it to your back?" Rolf said speechlessly. "Even if the UV rays are strong, how can they reach your back?" "I have OCD, don't you know?" Margaret laughed. "If you're going to apply sunscreen, you should apply it all over your body." For some reason, even though the temperature inside the car was quite low under Rolf's control, he still felt a bit hot. "Merlin, damn weather, could you be any hotter?" The heat was so intense that not only was Rolf irritable, but even the magical creatures had hidden away. The boy had driven for half an hour without seeing a single animal. As far as the eye could see, there was only a vast, desolate desert, and the narrow road, like a yellow, murky stream, meandered through the wasteland, the jeep a lonely little boat. It wasn't until they came across a vast expanse of cacti that Rove stopped the car and walked towards the towering cacti. Cacti are the most common plants in the desert, but these were no ordinary species. They were called Sagittarius, as the name suggests, gigantic cactus trees, reaching up to 20 meters in height, truly colossal trees among cacti. As Sagittarius grows to a certain age, it develops numerous branches, like arms reaching upwards, forming a giant candelabra shape with a main trunk. Numerous huge, bluish-green spines stood tall and arrayed in the desert wilderness, stretching out thousands of giant arms towards the sky, a truly awe-inspiring sight. Sagittarius is also unique to Arizona, even Professor Sprout's greenhouse doesn't cultivate it. Margaret also got out of the car, wrapped in sun-protective clothing, and came over with an umbrella, shielding Rove's hut from most of the canopy. Seeing the young man pick up a cactus, she asked curiously, "Are you going to transplant it into the box?" "Yes," Rove nodded. "When did you become interested in plants?" Margaret raised her beautiful eyebrows. "I thought you were only interested in animals. I can control the growth of plants," Rove explained. "It's quite fun fighting with these giant cacti. Imagine the thrill of a giant cactus rising up, its spikes shooting out to turn an opponent into a pincushion. It's exciting just thinking about it." Coming to the Thunderbird Sanctuary wasn't easy, so Rove planned to transplant more giant cacti and give a few to Neville. Margaret waved her wand, and her parasol floated in midair. She crouched down, put on her dragon skin gloves, and began helping to dig up the cacti. Margaret dug up a large rock and suddenly exclaimed in surprise, "Hey, a petrified lizard!" Rove turned his head and saw a huge lizard covered in strangely shaped black scales, its body curled up into a ball. However, it had fainted. Margaret poked the lizard with a stick and chuckled, "Rov, this little guy has heat stroke." Rov stared at the petrified lizard, and suddenly a ding sounded in his mind. One petrified lizard with heat radiation sickness detected, triggering side quest 1, help the petrified lizard treat its heat radiation sickness. Reward, magic, petrify objects, consumes magic to petrify any object. Side quest 2, complete 100% taming of the petrified lizard. Reward, magic, rock hard, makes the body as hard as stone. Note, can harden parts of the body as hard as stone. The petrification of the petrified lizard is different from that of the basilisk. The basilisk's petrification only stiffens the wizard's body, but it's still the same body. The petrified lizard's petrification truly turns objects into stone. Of course, the rock hard spell doesn't actually turn things into stone, but rather gives them the hardness of stone. Rove picked up the petrified lizard suffering from heat stroke, intending to take it back to the car and give it heat stroke medication. Regardless, he had to learn this second skill. The bird snake had only given him extraordinary length, but length didn't equate to toughness. Now he finally made up for his weakness. Rove and Margaret returned to the jeep and continued driving. Suddenly, he saw a girl standing by the roadside, waving vigorously at them. The girl's clothing was strange, a single piece of light-colored deerskin draped over her shoulders like a cloak, and a rectangular piece of tanned leather wrapped around her lower body, forming a leather skirt. On her feet, she wore tanned leather boots and leggings, the leggings reaching her knees and fastened to the boots. "She's a Native American," Margaret frowned. Among the Native Americans were muggles, and some who resembled wizards. Their relationship with wizards was very complex. Rove, not wanting to cause trouble, turned the steering wheel, intending to avoid the girl. But suddenly the girl knelt on the ground and began kowtowing repeatedly towards the jeep. Chapter 288 The Skinwalker. Even in the Middle Ages, European wizards were aware of the existence of the Americas and had numerous contacts with the magical groups among the indigenous peoples. These exchanges remained relatively peaceful and friendly. However, with the advent of the Age of Exploration, colonists brought guns, germs, and steel, and engaged in widespread massacres of the indigenous populations, turning peace into hatred. The emergence of the purifiers further strained the relationship between European and Native American wizards. Of course, in this modern era, the Magical Congress of America has established a new order in the North American magical world, and the two sides coexist peacefully. But in this remote area, Rove still kept his distance from the Native Americans and had no intention of contacting them. However, the sight of the Native American girl kneeling on the ground and kowtowing repeatedly made it impossible for him to ignore her. The young man had no choice but to stop the car, roll down the window, and ask, "Excuse me, is there anything I can do to help you?" While the Native Americans are called Indians, this is a general term for all indigenous peoples except the Inuit, not referring to a single ethnic group or race. Therefore, the languages of the indigenous peoples vary greatly. It's no exaggeration to say that a single phrase can sound different every 10 miles. Communicating with them is truly difficult for anyone without professional knowledge. Fortunately, this Native American girl could speak English, although her accent was even more pronounced than Fleur's. but at least it was understandable. My name is Dana. Some members of our tribe have been poisoned. Many have died. Please. Can anyone contact a healer to save them? Margaret, sitting in the passenger seat, looked directly into Dana's eyes. She scrutinized her carefully and said softly, "Where's your tribe's healer? I became a healer after my mother died," Dana said, trembling. "But I've never seen this kind of poison before. I can't cure it." Tears welled in her eyes, trickling down her cheeks. "Please help me, save my people. I'll do anything for you." Margaret scrutinized the girl meaningfully for a long time, finally whispering to Rove, "She's not lying." Rove nodded slightly, letting out a sigh of relief. Margaret could access memories, see into people's hearts, and determine if someone was lying. Having such a natural-born mind-manipulating master by your side certainly made things easier. "Hurry up and get in the car," Rove honked the horn, saying, "I'm the healer you're looking for." Dana was startled, staring in disbelief at the boy who was even younger than her, but ultimately walked towards the jeep, tears streaming down her face. Sitting in the back seat, the girl suddenly realized the car was very cold, as if isolating the scorching outside weather into two separate worlds. But that low temperature also stung her reddened skin. Dana had walked all day along the road, the scorching sun and burning earth baking her skin like this. Margaret took out some ointment and handed it to the girl, smiling kindly. "Your skin is sunburned, this will help." Dana gratefully accepted the ointment, only then noticing Margaret's stunning beauty. Guided by Dana, Rove drove off the planned route, heading forward along the winding valley. Arizona is considered the most Mars-like place on Earth, and for good reason. The cliffs on both sides are entirely red rock, with towering crimson pillars standing against the pink sky. The scorching wind whips up grains of red sand, pounding against the jeep. They eventually pass through a deep valley, where some low buildings came into view, a small Native American village of ochre red houses. Rove parked the car in the center of the village, got out, and looked up, and there he saw a step pyramid. The pyramid had 9 levels, each with 4 trapezoidal sides, each with a staircase leading to the top. The highest level was a square altar. The pyramid's walls were covered with exquisite bas-reliefs of magical creatures, lifelike and decorated with gold and jewels. On the north side of the pyramid was a statue of a giant, feathered serpent with wings, its thick body coiled into the shape of the number 8, its teeth biting its tail. That was Quetzalcoatl, a magical creature long considered extinct by the magical academic community, and the harpy was a hybrid offspring of Quetzalcoatl and other magical creatures. They hadn't seen a single native in the entire tribe. Led by Dana, they arrived at a large wooden hut. It turned out the natives were all gathered there. Rove had initially thought only a few were injured, but now there were at least 30 people lying inside, and more than a dozen others caring for the sick. The air was thick with the smell of herbs, smoke billowing from the stove like an erupting volcano, but the smell couldn't mask the deathly aura of the clearing. As Rove entered the hut, he glimpsed 3 corpses, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions, dark spots etched on their skin. A man had just died, and a woman, seemingly his wife, was sobbing over the body. Rove and Margaret's appearance undoubtedly attracted everyone's attention. The Native Americans stared intently at them. Dana communicated with her people in the native language, but they looked at Ralph and Margaret with distrust. This was understandable. They were both very young, just children, showing absolutely no signs of being reliable. Ralph didn't mind. He walked to the recently deceased body and examined it closely. As a magizoologist, Ralph had traveled extensively with Newt over the years, seeing many corpses and even dissecting many for pathological research. He had a considerable understanding of the human body. The boy quickly frowned and whispered to Margaret, "A recently deceased body still has flowing blood. It only congeals later, like a thick jelly, but look at this body." Margaret quickly understood Ralph's meaning. The body seemed to have been dead for a long time. The blood had congealed into a black powder. And those corpses? Dana just said they've been dead for several days. Margaret thought for a moment, then asked doubtfully, "In such hot weather, they should have started to stink long ago, but they don't smell at all, and they haven't rotted." Ralph frowned. He drew his fairy dagger and gently cut open the man's arm. A stench wafted from the wound, so strong it was suffocating. "It looks like symptoms of eating snapdragons," Ralph murmured. At that moment, Dana ran to a 4 or 5-year-old boy, took his hand, and cried, "Aru, wake up." The boy had already fainted and was on the verge of death. Dana knelt before Ralph and Margaret, sobbing as she managed to say, "Can you please save him? "This is my brother." Ralph walked towards the boy, and suddenly, a ding sounded in his mind. A male wizard has been detected suffering from poisoning. Triggering a side quest, help Aru cure the poisoning. Reward, Skinwalker, completely skin an animal, use special magic to craft it, and when a wizard wears the skin, they can transform into that animal's appearance. Thanks to Mango Sauce Petrichor and Starcolor for their generous donations. Chapter 289 The Egg of Quetzalcoatl. The difference between humans and animals lies in their ability to create and use tools. Therefore, the importance of tools is self-evident, even influencing the development and direction of a civilization. Just as the invention of the wand made learning and mastering magic much easier, it also contributed to the flourishing of European magic, leading to a proliferation of ingenious spells. For the Native Americans of North America, due to natural geographical isolation, they were unable to enjoy the benefits of wands for a long time. However, they found alternative methods, learning to use the hides and blood of magical creatures for spellcasting. Animal hides and blood, similar to the wood and core of wands, also possessed powerful magical energy. Based on this spellcasting system, the Native Americans created Lether Walkers, a high-level shape-shifting ability similar to Animagus. Of course, compared to Animagus, Lether Walkers require killing, exchanging death for the power of shape-shifting. The shape-shifted creature must also be roughly the same size as the wizard. This limitation naturally excludes animals that are too small or too large. But while Animagus can only transform into a fixed animal, Lether Walkers can transform into multiple animals. Therefore, both types of magic have their advantages and disadvantages. However, academic questions weren't Rove's immediate concern. He needed to save lives. The boy examined the Native Americans' conditions again, and after repeated examinations and discussions with Margaret, confirmed that they had been poisoned by snapdragon toxin. Snapdragon is also called skullwort. The two names are very different, stemming from the fact that its appearance varies greatly depending on when it blooms and fades. When in bloom, the snapdragon's flowers are exceptionally beautiful, their graceful shape resembling goldfish swimming in water. When the flowers fade, the snapdragon forms seed pods shaped like terrifying skulls with two eyes and a mouth, a truly chilling sight. These skull-shaped seed pods contain a slow-acting poison. After ingesting large quantities, the blood gradually coagulates into lumps. Their blood is poisonous. We need to use leech therapy to draw out the poison, Rove instructed Dana. You need to catch as many black leeches as possible. Okay, I understand. Dana quickly nodded. She went to talk to her tribesmen again, but they clearly didn't trust Ralph, and an argument ensued. Ralph remained silent, simply waiting quietly. He was just a doctor, he couldn't make decisions for others. Whether they believed him or not was their business, not his. The argument continued until two more tribesmen died before the Native Americans reached a consensus to go out and search for leeches. While waiting, Ralph had Dana take him to her medicine storeroom. Like Hagrid's cabin, the herbs here were sold by weight. The magical plant unique to Arizona, bitter rice flower, alone filled half the room. In one cabinet were over 100 corked vials and countless jars of dried herbs, each labeled with the name of the medicine. These were the tribe's ancestral secret remedies. Ralph planned to ask Dana for some before leaving. She probably wouldn't refuse. Of course, that was assuming he saved her tribesmen. If he failed, he'd have to figure out how to escape with Margaret. Soon, the tribesmen brought black leeches, as large as hairy peppers, completely black, and utterly repulsive. Rove treated Dana's younger brother, Aru, first, cutting open the boy's chest with a dagger. Black pus and blood slowly flowed out. He picked up a leech and poured it onto Aru's pale chest. The black leech burrowed into the wound along the blood trail. Prepare a large tub for me, Rove continued. Fill it with boiling water. It wasn't that he wanted to bathe, but rather to bathe the black leeches. Black leeches were a double-edged sword. They could absorb toxins, but if not eliminated in time, they would drain the boy dry. Fortunately, black leeches fear high temperatures. After being steamed in hot water for a while, they would emerge from the body. A fire was quickly lit at the door, and once the bath water was boiling, it was poured into the large mahogany tub. Rove helped the boy into the tub. After soaking for less than 3 minutes, the long leech emerged from his body. Rove carefully removed the leeches. The insect slowly wriggled between his fingers. They were no longer black, but had turned a shiny pink after sucking blood. He didn't need to kill them. He could keep them as snacks for the little snake monster, bursting with juice in every bite, a tangy and satisfying treat. Rav, as a mother, was certainly doing his job. After transferring Aru to the bed, Rav gave him painkillers. Halfway through, the boy suddenly regained consciousness and began coughing violently. The room instantly erupted in cheers, shouts, whistles, gasps of alarm, excited whispers, and Dana's sobs. Rav wiped the sweat from his brow and breathed a sigh of relief. If the treatment had failed, he would have immediately taken Margaret and run away. Thankfully, it had succeeded. That's how it is in the medical profession. Some doctors demand money, some demand lives. Rav then treated another person, demonstrating the entire process to Dana in meticulous detail. "Alright, treat them this way." After giving his instructions, Ralph turned and left the room. Margaret had disappeared, so the boy quickly searched the village and finally found her in the northwest corner. The girl was standing by a well, bending over and looking down. "You're not going to jump in and commit suicide, are you?" Ralph walked up to Margaret and laughed. "If you jump, I won't save you." Margaret winked and giggled. "Don't worry, if I commit suicide, I'll definitely take you with me. It'll be like we've both died for love." What a tragic way to die. Much better than me dying old and unattractive in bed, and you being eaten by magical creatures, right, you big idiot. Ralph rolled his eyes. Margaret reached out and hugged Ralph, who radiated a chill, as if he were a block of ice. She snuggled against him, saying comfortably, "It's so hot, it's much colder hugging you. What do you think of those poisoned Native Americans? Someone must have poisoned them," Ralph said in a low voice. Snapdragons are a magical plant from the Mediterranean, rarely seen in North America. The possibility of them collectively ingesting them is too small. I just asked Dana, and she said this is their tribe's main source of drinking water. Margaret tapped the edge of the well. "You think someone poisoned them here?" Ralph frowned. "What's the purpose?" "It's probably for that pyramid," Margaret whispered. "Those reliefs?" Ralph asked doubtfully. "There's indeed gold and gems on them. They look quite valuable." "No. I mean the things in the altar at the top of the pyramid." Margaret shook her head. "What could be there?" "I've seen Dana's memories." Margaret leaned close to Ralph's ear and whispered, "At the top of the pyramid is a feathered serpent egg." Chapter 290 Dragon Crystal Short Knife. Although many of Dana's tribesmen were injured, the treatment methods were basically the same, and the entire treatment process was not complicated. Therefore, by evening, most of them had been treated and were basically out of danger. Of course, they could not engage in strenuous activity for the time being and needed to rest for a few days, but they had survived. The entire tribe immediately held a grand sacrificial ceremony. Native American sacrificial ceremonies generally did not allow outsiders to participate, but Rove had saved their people, and he and Margaret were allowed to watch from a distance. In front of the pyramid, the Native Americans erected a piece of wood, scraped off the bark with a knife, and drew the image of the feathered serpent god on it. Brightly colored feathers were then inserted into the top of the trunk, making them look like Native Americans, to symbolize the dead. Accompanied by a sudden bronze bird's cry, they began to sing and dance, including the Native American women. They had a unique beauty and charm, which allowed Rove to truly experience the traditional customs of North American Native Americans. However, each of them was covered with white clay, which slightly obscured their appearance, making it less pleasing to the eye. Bundles of hay were tossed into the large brazier, instantly releasing a rich, grassy aroma, and smoke billowed towards the pyramid. Ralph could feel the surrounding temperature suddenly surge, waves of heat rising from the ground, making the pyramid appear like a mirage. Accompanied by the rhythmic beat of drums, the sunlit section of the pyramid's north wall cast a wavy shadow on the ground. The shadow merged with a feathered serpent sculpture, appearing as if a giant serpent was crawling down from the top of the pyramid. Ralph marveled at this exquisite composition created by light and shadow, then looked up at the top of the pyramid, at the square altar. According to magical research, the feathered serpent had perished long ago, yet Margaret had seen the feathered serpent's egg being offered in Dana's memories. How intriguing. After the ceremony, the natives organized a banquet to entertain Ralph and Margaret. They didn't refuse and sat down at the table with Dana, but upon seeing the food, they were both hesitant to eat. Insect eggs, locusts, crow meat, and ant pies. Could things get any darker? The giant saguaro's fruit, however, tasted good, and the wine made from it was sweet and sour, with a touch of honey. It was practically a delicacy. "These are all delicacies," Dana recommended. "Rav, you should try them. These insect eggs are marinated with spices and then coated with honey. They're sweet and spicy." "Yes," Margaret smeared locusts on the ant pies and handed them to Rov, grinning mischievously. These insects really do taste good. You should try them. You're growing. Don't let your stomach get upset. Why aren't you eating? Rov rolled his eyes. I'm allergic to honey, Margaret said with a grin. Don't waste it. Wasting food is a crime. In his previous life, Rov always liked to say he was allergic to alcohol when drinking. He never expected Margaret to use that excuse first. Of course, not all of it was culinary monstrosity. There was also roast suckling pig and charcoal grilled rabbit, though they were coated in a layer of green broth, making one wonder if they were clean and hygienic. He certainly didn't want to be a jetpack fighter tonight. Halfway through the banquet, a sudden uproar erupted. Looking up, Rolf saw everyone pounding their chests and shouting wildly, "Creepers! Creepers! Creepers!" A man 2 meters and 2 centimeters tall walked to the center of the square. They brought out a cage containing 7 wolves, which were quickly released. It's a beast fight, Dana explained. The creepers will fight these wolves hand to hand. The tall man took out a thick bearskin, wrapped it tightly around himself, and began chanting incantations, casting the skinwalker spell. He quickly vanished, transforming into a black bear, standing upright, and letting out a thunderous roar. The black bear roared angrily, revealing a mouthful of huge yellow teeth, then, on all fours, charged at full speed towards the 7 wolves. With a single swipe of its claws, the creeper broke the bones of a wolf. It twisted the wolf's neck, opened its mouth wide, and began to drink its blood. The creeper then ripped out the wolf's heart, held it bloody high above its head, and took a vicious bite. The Native Americans believed that the heart of a wild animal would make them stronger, so a deafening roar erupted from the crowd. Rolf and Margaret watched with great interest. When the battle ended, Dana suddenly pulled out a box and whispered, "This is a gift from our chief to you two, a token of our gratitude for saving our people." Dana opened the box. Inside were some jewelry, all crafted from gold and precious stones. One headdress was particularly beautiful, its surface bright and gleaming with gold, inlaid with amber and jade on both sides. Margaret took out the headdress and put it on. The girl's soft golden hair cascaded over her shoulders, reaching her waist, and under the delicate golden headdress, she appeared even more regal and awe-inspiring. Dana gazed at the beautiful Margaret, somewhat lost in thought. She couldn't help but glance at her own rough skin, her eyes filled with envy, inferiority, and longing. Many Native Americans looked at the beautiful girl, their attention shifting from the battle to whisper amongst themselves. Even the creeper stopped eating, looked up at Margaret, a burning glint in his eyes. Margaret, oblivious to the stares around her, removed her headdress and placed it on Rov's head. She then pinched the boy's handsome face and laughed. "Not bad, little Rov. You'll look even better in my dress. Want to try it on tonight?" Rov removed the headdress and put it in the box. Seeing that the boy didn't seem very interested in the gold, Dana quickly asked, "Don't you like these? Do you have weapons made of dragon crystal?" Rov asked. "I'm more interested in the weapons you forge." The fairies were famous for forging weapons, and the Native Americans of North America were equally adept at weapon forging, especially stone tools, where they were unparalleled in the world. The reason was simple: iron ore in the Americas was mainly distributed in uncivilized areas like the Great Lakes. This natural deficiency resulted in a lack of iron tools. For thousands of years, the Native Americans of North America could only specialize in stone tools, developing them to another extreme. Obsidian, known as dragon crystal, is a gemstone formed from the sudden cooling of volcanic lava, possessing potent magical energy. Native American wizards utilize dragon crystal to forge weapons and enchant them in special ways. Their sharpness rivals that of fairy weapons. Dana pondered for a moment, then drew a black dagger from the leather tucked into her waistband. The secret to their forged weapons' power lies in the sacrifice of magical creatures for enchantment. Dana's dagger, however, not only used the life force of magical creatures but also, she secretly used her own blood, soaking it monthly, making its sharpness even more astonishing. "Rov, this is for you, to thank you for saving my brother," Dana said, handing it to the boy. Rov took the dragon crystal dagger. It was as light as a feather, gleaming with a black light, and had no hilt. A dark red light danced on the blade, a thin, blood-red line outlining its sharp edge. He lightly flicked the dagger and exclaimed, "A fine knife." After a grand banquet, everyone, full and satisfied, returned to their homes. Dana invited Rolf and Margaret to stay at her house that night, but they declined and returned to the jeep. As the noise subsided and all the lights in the houses went out, The entire village returned to darkness and silence. After an unknown amount of time, a figure suddenly appeared. Under the full moon, the person moved through the silent road like a long, gray shadow. The person stealthily made their way to the jeep parked at the edge of the village. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 291 Thunderbird. A plant was ignited by flames and began to burn fiercely. Pale flames quickly devoured the withered leaves, leaving only a few remnants, wisps of smoke drifting in the air. After the smoke completely dissipated, the dark figure waited a long time before pulling a dragon crystal dagger from his pocket. He walked to the jeep, raised the dagger, stabbed it through the door, and slashed downwards. The metal sheet was as easy as paper. The dark figure opened the car door, his eyes wide, staring intently into the car in the moonlight, seemingly questioning and judging, because there was no one inside. Only a cactus, placed on the seat. The dark figure narrowed his eyes, looking left and right, and indeed did not see the beautiful witch, nor the annoying boy beside her. Oh dear, this car is one I rented, and the rental fee wasn't cheap. And you've ruined it like this, it's giving me a real headache. A voice suddenly rang out, and the dark figure turned around abruptly, seeing the witch he had only glanced at once but couldn't forget. Margaret stood under a tree not far away, her arm draped over the blonde boy's shoulder, and asked with a smile, "It wouldn't be right if you didn't compensate us, and a lot of money, right, Ralph?" "That's right." Ralph nodded slightly, staring at the dark figure, and said, "It's time to settle the compensation issue. Creeper, you have that strange name, don't you?" Creeper, who had just performed a beast fight at the banquet not long ago, stared intently at the two of them. He clenched his fists and said in a rough voice in English, "Why are you two? Why didn't you fall into deep sleep?" Ralph sniffed, a smile playing on his lips, and said, "Could it be that you didn't burn enough of your sleeping grass, so it didn't work? Why don't you burn some more now and see if you can knock us both out?" Creeper fell silent, the dim moonlight casting a sinister orange hue on his skin and casting deep shadows under his eyes. The man didn't know where he'd gone wrong, but oh well. He clenched his fist, which was as big as a sandbag, and snarled, "Kid, if you don't want to die, hand over that woman next to you." Ralph was somewhat surprised. He'd initially thought the creeper was there to rob him. After all, the gold jewelry and jewels the Indian chief had given him looked incredibly valuable, and it was easy to be tempted. But he never expected him to be after Margaret. Well, she was indeed a great beauty, completely inheriting Queenie's beauty and sex appeal. Only her personality was a bit eccentric. Sure enough, upon hearing the creeper's words, Margaret wasn't frightened. Instead, she burst into laughter, a bright and joyful expression on her face, like an alluring fox spirit. She leaned against the boy, almost clinging to him, and said weakly, "Love, someone's trying to take your sister away." "What should we do? Can a dead man take from a living man?" Love said calmly. "I'm curious." "Creeper, you've been exposed. Aren't you going to run? Aren't you afraid I'll shout and your whole tribe will hear you?" "Hear me?" Creeper laughed, like a mad dog howling. "So what if they hear me? They're already in deep trouble tonight." Suddenly, a muffled rumble of thunder echoed in the sky. Love turned sharply and saw roaring, churning cloud high in the sky, filled with boundless lightning and thunder. Margaret gazed at the shadow in the lightning, her eyebrows arching slightly. "Thunderbird, that's right." Creeper laughed heartily, a hint of smugness in his voice. "Those idiots are too busy with their own problems to come and save you too. Looks like you're the one who poisoned the well." Ralph raised an eyebrow. "You're the mole, kid, you know too much." A cold glint flashed in Creeper's eyes. "You shouldn't have come here with Dana. Without you, they would all be dead, and tonight's operation would have gone much more smoothly." However, Creeper looked at Margaret again, his eyes burning with desire and greed. "It's fortunate you came." At that moment, as the dark clouds grew thicker, a torrential downpour began, the raindrops pattering against the leaves, trees, and rocks. In the pouring rain, Margaret held up an umbrella to shield herself and Ralph from the downpour. The boy continued, "Dana and the others are your people. How can you be so ruthless?" "What do you know?" Creeper laughed, the rain lashing his face, but he seemed oblivious. "I'm the strongest man in this tribe. I should have a bright future, but I'm stuck in this small place, fighting wild beasts every day. But those guys are different. They'll give me lots and lots of gold, the life I want, as long as I help them poison things, help them get that stuff." "What?" Ralph asked. "You're dead, then I'll tell you." Creeper suddenly tightened his animal skin, transforming into a giant black bear, roaring as he charged forward. Ralph's expression didn't change much, he simply raised his arm. Creeper suddenly felt something entangle his feet. He looked down and saw countless vines coiling upwards. Creeper struggled fiercely, the vines tearing apart like the animal skin, but more vines swarmed in. Creeper chanted an incantation, his beast blood glowing like a flame, scorching the vines. But with a whoosh, a nice arrow pierced the black bear's left eye. Streams of saliva and blood dripped from Creeper's gaping mouth, then a second ice arrow struck his thigh. The black bear roared, his paws sliding across the damp, slippery ground, and in an instant, he slumped to the side and fell to the ground. The cactus in the jeep suddenly began to grow, countless sharp thorns shooting out simultaneously, piercing the black bear's fur and flesh, turning him into a hedgehog. Creeper transformed back into human form, lying sprawled on the blood-soaked mud. Ralph walked slowly over, and the not yet completely dead Creeper suddenly pleaded. "Spare me. I can give you gold. I have many crafted magical animal hides. My dragon crystal dagger is definitely sharper than Dana's. Margaret, what do you think?" Ralph turned and asked. Margaret was squatting on the ground when she found a baby bird, its wings soaked from the rain that had fallen from its nest. "Not very good. This guy's gold is ours, his dagger is ours, and his hides are all ours." Margaret reached out and picked up the baby bird, wiping the raindrops from its wings with her sleeve before gently placing it in her palm. She sneered, "You actually used our things as compensation. Looks like you only have one life to offer as compensation." Ralph smiled. "How do you want to die?" The Creeper lay on the ground, turning its head to look at the beautiful woman. Its mouth opened, but the words stuck in its throat, only blood flowing out. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Ralph laughed. "Too bad you'll never see it again." The boy gripped the dagger Dana had given him, piercing the Creeper's eyeball, then gently twisting it, smashing its skull. At that moment, a torrential downpour, like a black curtain, covered the entire village. In the distance, a huge shadow descended, spreading its wings as black as night, and landed on the pyramid. Lightning struck suddenly, a dazzling blue-white beam hitting the top of the pyramid and illuminating the Thunderbird. Chapter 292 Thunder King. Dark clouds, howling winds, and torrential rain shrouded the land, with streaks of lightning flashing across the sky, accompanied by rumbling thunder, piercing the hazy night. The tribe's wild animals began to howl one after another, their cries growing louder and louder until they became a cacophony of shouts. Then, a sharp sound pierced the darkness, not the howls of beasts, but the hunting horns of the Native Americans, signaling impending danger. All the sleeping Native Americans rushed out of their rooms and gathered towards the pyramid plaza. Lightning tore through the sky again, and in an instant, the night was as bright as day. Everyone could see the Thunderbird in the sky, and the two shamans on its back. At the command of the two shamans, lightning struck the altar atop the pyramid, sending rubble raining down from the rock face. "Damn it, it's those guys again. Get out of here, strangers, you're not welcome here, fuck you," the Native Americans roared and shouted at the sky, filling the air with a cacophony of curses and insults. The wizards riding on the Thunderbirds remained unfazed, not because they were in a good mood, but because they couldn't understand. Stone spears flew from the crowd, aimed at the Thunderbirds, and more followed, but were struck down by lightning before they could get close. Dana looked around anxiously. An arm was draped over her shoulder, and the girl turned to look at it, letting out a sigh of relief. "Ruff, I'm so glad you're all right. Why are you alone? Where's Margaret?" "She has some things to do." Ruff looked up at the Thunderbird and the wizard riding it. Although he already had a guess, he still asked, "Who are they? What are they doing?" "We don't know these attackers either," Dana explained, her face pale. "They came to our tribe half a year ago, demanding the feathered serpent's egg. The chieftain refused them, so they attacked us with a Thunderbird. After being driven back, they didn't show up for a long time, but they came again today." Ruff nodded slightly. It seemed that Creeper, the traitor, was cooperating with the two of them to steal the feathered serpent's egg stored at the altar at the top of the pyramid. "Do you really have the feathered serpent's egg?" Ruff asked, his face full of curiosity. Dana hesitated for a moment, then sighed and whispered, "Our tribe has worshipped that egg for centuries, but it's just a fossil, a dead egg, just a fossil." Ralph was somewhat disappointed. He had thought it could actually hatch. After all, the feathered serpent was a legendary magical creature that had gone extinct long ago. If it could hatch, it would be like Muggles resurrecting dinosaurs. But if it was just a fossil, its value was greatly diminished. Wait, if it was just a fossil, these two wizards wouldn't have gone to such lengths to steal it, even bribing an insider to poison it? Just then, a man as thin as a bamboo pole walked over. His thick, black beard stretched almost from his chin to his waist, making his long, narrow face appear even longer. The man carried a large wooden bucket. Dana took a deep breath, took out a small knife, and cut her arm. Blood gushed out and fell into the bucket. The tall man ignored Ralph and moved on to the next tribesman. Soon, the blood of all the Indians in the square was in the bucket. The man approached the chieftain, a thin, old man with a wrinkled face and a completely bald head. Various medals from his necklace hung loosely from his throat. Rob looked up, and the old man suddenly produced an egg from his robes, the most beautiful thing the boy had ever seen, its rich patterns making it seem as if it were studded with jewels. The old man placed a fossilized egg into the wooden tub. Rob stared intently at the egg. It seemed to be alive, thirstily drinking the blood, quickly turning a dark red under the boy's gaze. Dana, her face growing paler, asked worriedly, "I wonder if it's enough." Rob looked at the girl in confusion. "All of us who contribute blood sacrifice a portion of our lives to the feathered serpent god. The more life it absorbs, the stronger the power it bestows upon the egg bearer," Dana explained softly. "But many of our people are injured. They can't come here to sacrifice." Rob suddenly understood. No wonder the other man had poisoned it. That was his plan. At that moment, the wizards in the sky also noticed the egg in the old man's hand. The egg had been hidden in the pyramid altar, but it turned out it had been moved long ago. Their attacks had been futile. Lightning tore through the night sky, striking the old man with tremendous force. Ralph quickly raised his wand and shouted, "Protect yourself," but his ironclad charm was clearly no match for the lightning's power. The lightning struck the ground, exploding brilliantly, like a broken water tank spilling outwards. The old man was struck by the lightning. The stench of burning flesh overwhelmed any fragrance, and his howl was drowned out by the electric current. Just when Ralph thought the old man was already electrocuted, he didn't fall. Instead, he held the egg in his hands and began to sing in a high-pitched, shrill voice. At this moment, all the Indians turned pale. A portion of their lives had already been sacrificed. Suddenly, Ralph heard an explosion, and a ball of flame erupted from the egg, engulfing the old man. His song became even louder and sharper. The flames on the old man's body swirled and twisted, chasing each other, quickly climbing up the pyramid. The air seemed to liquefy from the intense heat, shimmering in the night. The old man held the feathered serpent's egg high, opened his mouth, and spat out long tongues of fire, licking the Thunderbird's belly. The Thunderbird screamed in agony, nearly boiled alive. Ralph stared intently at the egg. Its power was incredible, and it was a dead egg. Under the old man's attack, the flames soared, his enormous, fiery red wings forcing the Thunderbird to retreat. Two wizards pulled on the chains binding the Thunderbird, controlling it to retreat. In the plaza, all the Indians cheered and jumped for joy, but their excited shouts abruptly stopped. The old man suddenly collapsed to the ground. He was dead. As the old man fell, the feathered serpent's egg also fell to the ground, rolling on the ground. The cheers instantly turned into screams, and the plaza immediately descended into chaos. Everything happened so fast. Everyone was screaming and stumbling, pushing and shoving each other. Some were sobbing uncontrollably as they rushed towards their chieftain. The Thunderbird suddenly flew towards the crowd, but its target was the feathered serpent's egg. In the chaos, Dana, who was standing closest, snatched the egg. Rough, Dana tossed the egg high into the air, and it landed in the boy's hands. He was quickly engulfed in flames. So hot. I want to run naked. Chapter 293 The Power of Quetzalcoatl. Flames enveloped Ralph, his entire body radiating heat, as if he were wearing a flowing orange robe, a stark contrast to the night. Ralph was burning hot, he could feel his blood boiling, yet he felt no pain, only a surge of power. That powerful force flowed continuously into his body from the feathered serpent's egg. The boy held the feathered serpent's egg in his hands, gently touching and examining it, clearly feeling the layer of stone on its surface. It was indeed a fossil, but not a dead egg. It was pulsating, each pulsation emitting a deep, resonant sound. Ralph felt as if he were holding a bloodied heart in his palm. At this moment, The Thunderbird circled in midair, refusing to descend any further. It was extremely sensitive to danger, able to sense a terrifying aura. It was a natural suppression emanating from its bloodline. The two wizards riding on the Thunderbird's back, seeing that it refused to descend, one of them took out a bronze bell and shook it vigorously. The bell rang out with a loud, clear tinkling sound, like a small hammer striking an anvil. Hearing the bell, the Thunderbird seemed to be whipped, its body involuntarily shrinking back, letting out a mournful cry, and forced to descend to the ground. The man, as thin as a bamboo pole, having confirmed the chieftain's death, gripped his dragon crystal spear and charged at the Thunderbird like a madman. The man ringing the bell suddenly raised his wand, striking the tall, thin man with a spell, sending him sprawling to the ground. He struggled to his feet, but the Thunderbird bit his forearm and flung him far away like a cat tossing a mouse. The Indians charged angrily, but lightning struck, the current spreading outwards in concentric rings from the Thunderbird. The Indians screamed and cursed, retreating with sharp, intense fear in their voices. "Stop chasing." The man stopped shaking the bell and commanded, "Attack the boy with the egg." The Thunderbird looked up at Rolf not far away, flapping its wings wildly like a thunderclap. Its body turned black and gold, and lightning flashed in its eyes. A thunderclap and lightning roared in the sky, and another bolt of lightning crashed down, striking Rolf directly. Boom! The blinding light made Rolf squint. He raised the egg high in his hand, his eyes like two pools of molten lava. The boy swung his arm, and flames shot out. Fire and lightning collided violently, creating a deafening explosion in the air. From a distance, it looked like a layer of blue flames leaping wildly in midair, illuminating the entire village as if it were daytime. The scorching heat spread outwards, causing extreme distortion of vision. The Native Americans all knelt on the ground, chanting the hymn of Quetzalcoatl to Rolf, to the egg in his hand. Soon, the lightning was engulfed by flames, and a ball of orange-red fire shot into the sky before gradually dissipating. Rolf finally understood why the other party wanted to steal the feathered serpent's egg. After sacrificing a certain amount of life, it could indeed generate immense power. Rolf stretched out his arms, and two flames suddenly leaped up, like two long, fiery whips. With a hiss, the whips, like snakes, lashed out at the Thunderbird, binding its neck and wings. The Thunderbird struggled desperately, but the harder it struggled, the tighter the flames around its neck tightened. It opened its beak, letting out a sharp, hoarse, and painful cry. Rolf gripped the fiery whips tightly and pulled hard, almost breaking the Thunderbird's neck and wings, but it also lost its balance and stumbled to the ground, crashing into the feathered serpent statue. But this attack seemed to have completely exhausted the power the Native Americans had gained through sacrificing their lives. The egg stopped beating, turning back into cold stone, and the flames on the boy's body vanished abruptly. Rolf collapsed to the ground, his hands trembling, his body drenched in sweat, cold and sticky, each breath accompanied by heavy panting. He felt the exhaustion of someone who hadn't exercised in a long time suddenly running 5 kilometers. The Thunderbird crashed to the ground, throwing a wizard off its back. The wizard's head caught fire, his hair ablaze. The man roared in terror, then, seeing a group of Indians charging towards him, he immediately apparated and fled. One wizard remained. He stood up and ran towards Rolf, who was sitting on the ground. He wore a long purple robe made of special magical materials that could insulate against electricity, thus protecting him from the Thunderbird's lightning. He gazed greedily at the egg in the boy's hand, the thing he had always dreamed of, now, within reach. The wizard raised his wand and cried out, "Avada!" Before he could finish speaking, in the distance, Dana had already raised a bow high, and an arrow struck him squarely in the chest, piercing his lung. Rolf stood up and slowly walked over. A dragon crystal dagger appeared in his hand. With all his might, he plunged it into the man's ribs. Rolf approached the Thunderbird, which lay convulsing on the ground, bright red blood gushing from its mangled wound. Around the Thunderbird's neck was an iron collar, connected to a fist-thick iron chain. Rolf stared at the Thunderbird, and suddenly a ding sounded in his mind. Detected one enslaved Thunderbird, triggering side quest 1, heal the Thunderbird's wounds, reward magic, thunderous strike, use magic to create lightning to attack enemies. Side quest 2, 100% tame the Thunderbird, reward magic, stormy rain, can summon thunderclouds to create heavy rain. Standing in a room, Margaret looked with satisfaction at the results of her half-day's search. This was Creeper's room. According to him, there was gold, animal hides, and many other items. Margaret wasn't interested in these things, but Ralph seemed quite pleased, even asking her to find some loot. After a careful search, she did indeed have a considerable haul. Just then, a wizard appeared in the room with a snap, flames still burning on his head. The wizard quickly extinguished the flames, but due to the burns, the left side of his face was mangled, and his ear was completely burned away, leaving only a hole. He wasn't blind, but the area around his eyes was covered in large burns. Seeing a figure in the room, the wizard didn't think twice and immediately cursed, "Creeper, you bastard. Didn't we agree to poison your entire tribe? Look what you've done. Get the herbs over here." But the figure didn't move. The man looked up and saw it wasn't a creeper, but an extremely beautiful witch staring at him. The wizard asked in astonishment, "Who are you?" "I'm a police officer," Margaret smiled. The wizard raised his wand, but Margaret was faster, but what she raised wasn't a wand, but a gun. Margaret raised her pistol and fired 6 shots at the man. She smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear and said elegantly, "Sir, put down your wand immediately. Please cooperate." The wizard lay in a pool of blood, barely alive. Though not dead on the spot, he was only breathing weakly. Margaret glanced at her magazine. She had 1 bullet left. She decisively fired another shot, then licked her sexy lips and asked in a friendly manner, "Sir, are you all right? Should I call an ambulance from New York for you?" The man coughed, cough, cough, cough. Chapter 294, Suicide After Being Shot 7 Times in the Back? Ralph crouched on the ground, staring at the man who had been shot 7 times. He had just come to find Margaret, but upon entering the room, he witnessed this scene. Ralph had thought the man had escaped and was somewhat disappointed, but it turned out Margaret had found him and killed him. It was, in a way, very satisfying. However, for a wizard, especially a dark wizard, wasn't this kind of death a bit too humiliating? Even if he hadn't died from Avada Kedavra, even dying from Expelliarmus magic would still be magic. A wizard being shot, it was unbearable. Was this the new era of witch hunters? Burning was an outdated medieval method of death, now they had to keep up with the times and use firing squads and cannons? Okay, shooting it was. These 2 dark wizards had first poisoned the tribe, then attacked the village, killing many of Dana's people. Dying like Kennedy was too lenient for them. Actually, neither Ralph nor Margaret felt much remorse for killing the dark wizards. Rove, being a time traveler, was already psychologically mature. He knew all along that facing these dark wizards, it was either you or them, a very straightforward truth. Margaret was even more accustomed to it than Rove. Her father was the head of the Auror office and had offended many dark wizards and purgers. Their family had been attacked before, and young Margaret had witnessed the deaths. So, Rove squatted beside the corpse, thought for a moment, and finally said with a rather regretful tone, "This guy actually used Muggle methods to shoot himself." Margaret looked at Rove in surprise, inwardly scoffing, thinking that Rove was even better at lying than her older sister. Since Rove said suicide, it must be suicide. Margaret thought for a moment and asked, "What about the Indians? They're collecting the dead." Rove sighed. Compared to these 2 dark wizards, they were the truly innocent ones. The boy told Margaret everything that had happened in the square, including the strange feathered serpent egg. Margaret took the egg from Rove and examined it curiously, but no matter how she looked at it, it was a fossil. "What do you feel?" Rove asked. "Can you feel a heartbeat?" "No," Margaret shook her head. "It just feels as hard as stone. It seems it needs the magic of those Native Americans to be awakened," Rove said softly. Margaret held up the feathered serpent egg and asked curiously, "What do you plan to do with it?" "I'll return it to Dana and the others, of course," Rove said calmly. He certainly wanted to take it back to study, but this was a sacred object that the Native Americans had worshipped for centuries. Asking them to voluntarily donate it, and then rewarding them with 500 gallons and a banner, was just nonsense. If Rove forcibly took it, what difference would there be between him and that guy lying on the ground committing suicide? Rove considered himself a good guy with a relatively high moral standard, and of course, he disdained to do something like stealing by trickery. Besides, to awaken the egg, he needed the magic of the Native Americans, and he couldn't even speak their language, so taking it would be useless. Even if he learned the language, to regain that powerful strength, he would need to sacrifice his life. Who would he sacrifice himself to? After hearing Ralph's reasons, Margaret nodded slightly, but she still reminded him, keeping them here might not be a good thing for them. Since they've been targeted, someone might come to steal from them again. "I'll remind Dana to be more careful," Ralph said softly. But whatever they do is their own choice, and we can only respect it. The two stopped discussing the matter and began to take stock of the creeper's possessions, the extra spoils of the night. There was a considerable amount of gold, which Ralph and Margaret split in half, as well as animal hides, all made by the creeper to use the skinwalker magic for transformation. However, most of them were too large for Ralph, so he couldn't use much. After finishing everything, they left the room and headed towards the pyramid. At this moment, a roaring fire was lit again in the pyramid square, the firewood crackling and spitting sparks into the night sky. Around the campfire lay the bodies of the dead, bathed and dressed in their life's garments by their tribesmen, and sprinkled with fragrant oil. The Indians raised torches and set the dead ablaze. Thick smoke rose, and chanting resumed, this time a funeral dirge. The chanting gradually subsided, followed by complete silence. Ralph and Margaret sat on the steps nearby, quietly watching the funeral. As dawn broke, the funeral was complete, and a new chieftain was chosen. The new chieftain was the tall, thin shaman who, despite being thrown by the Thunderbird, had not died. His bravery had won the hearts of all. With the matter settled, Ralph and Margaret prepared to leave. Dana came to see them off, carrying a large bag of herbs. Ralph, I've written a potion recipes on parchment. Thank you, Dana. Ralph thanked her. If you have any problems, just write here. My grandfather is a magizoologist. He can help you with many things. I will remember. Dana felt a cool, wet sensation on her face. She wiped away her tears and hugged both of them. After saying goodbye, Ralph and Margaret walked towards the jeep. Beside the car, the Thunderbird was still chained. The Thunderbird was very obedient, even though Ralph had removed the chain from its neck and it wasn't tied to the ground, it still didn't run away. Clearly, this Thunderbird had been domesticated from a young age and had developed a strong sense of obedience. It also had serious injuries, mostly from the battle the previous night, and many more from accumulated wounds. Its back and broad wings were covered with crisscrossing old scars, the pale scars standing out against its beautiful feathers. Therefore, treating the Thunderbird would be difficult for Rove, as it suffered not only physical injuries but also psychological torment. These days, a qualified veterinarian often needs to also provide psychological counseling. The industry is incredibly competitive. Now that they had the Thunderbird, Rove and Margaret decided against taking the jeep and instead rode it home, which would be faster. They climbed onto the Thunderbird's back, and it spread its wings, kicking up dust that blurred Dana's vision, but through her stinging tears, she could still see the beast fly out of the tribe. The Thunderbird flew westward, over rolling sand dunes and deserts, across the Grand Canyon and the Kaibab Plateau. They finally arrived at a wizarding village shrouded in perpetual clouds. The Thunderbird landed on a house at the edge of the village. Margaret jumped off the Thunderbird, went to the door, and knocked loudly. The door opened quickly, and a witch with gray hair and a purple flower knot came out. Grandma, Margaret hugged the old woman, nuzzling her head against the witch's chest, and said sweetly, "Did you miss me, Margaret?" Tina laughed, patting the girl's head and giving her a gentle, wrinkled smile. A fat cat-like creature, smelling the scent, darted out of the house and pounced into Rove's arms. Rove almost fell over. He stroked the fat cat-like creature and laughed. "Morley, long time no see, you've gotten so fat." The cat-like creature, which had been so affectionate just moments before, now arched its back, hissed at the boy, and then raised its paw, smacking him hard on the head. Chapter 295 Newt's Lightning Rod. Like Queenie, Tina had aged. Her hair was almost entirely white, and her face was covered in wrinkles. But her eyes remained bright, like the eyes of a salamander, gleaming with a jewel-like luster. Tina stared, shifting her gaze from Margaret to Rove. Her previously kind smile had vanished, replaced by a stern expression. She hadn't seen Rove in almost 2 years. He hadn't returned for several holidays. The reprimands she had prepared caught in her throat, and tears finally streamed down her face. "Don't cry, Grandma," Rove comforted her, gently embracing the old woman and then Tina. Tina wiped away her tears, scrutinizing Rove closely. Her withered fingers traced the boy's cheek with extreme tenderness. "Why haven't you come back to see me?" Tina asked, her eyes brimming with tears. "Grandma, I actually wanted to come back last Christmas, but Grandpa stayed in Albania and refused to come back, so I had to stay with him." Seeing that Newt wasn't in the room, Ralph quickly shifted the blame. "Last summer too, he was in the Romanian Dragon Reserve and took me to Nico's funeral." Sigh. Tina wiped away her tears, laughing angrily. Your grandpa said the same thing, but he said it was because you wouldn't come back, and he was staying with you, Grandma. Let's go inside quickly." Margaret smiled and smoothed things over. "Your legs must be sore from standing all this time." "Okay." Tina took Ralph's hand with her left hand and Margaret's hand with her right, and walked towards the living room. The cat-like creature named Mahler, wiggling its rump, slowly followed behind. Cat-like creatures are peculiar and magical creatures. Their fur is covered in various spots, their ears are exceptionally large, and their tails resemble a lion's tail. Overall, they look very much like cats. What makes them peculiar is their extremely high intelligence. They can detect suspicious and untrustworthy people, similar to a spying effect. In the original timeline, Hermione's Crookshanks discovered Peter Pettigrew's problem because of his cat-like ancestry. Tina kept 3 purebred cats, Mahler, Hobby, and Millie. Ralph plopped down on the sofa, and as soon as he did, a fluffy ball of fur darted out from a crack and snuggled into Tina's lap. It was Hobby, who loved to squeeze into every corner. Once, he'd tried to warm himself in the fireplace and set his fur on fire. Mahler tried to jump onto Ralph's lap, but the boy coldly refused. It was far too fat now, having grown from a slightly chubby creature to a veritable giant pig. Ralph was a stickler for looks. He wouldn't pet any feline that wasn't attractive, and the self-disciplined Ralph had only ever petted Professor McGonagall in recent years. Ralph looked around. With Tina at home, things were noticeably different. The room was impeccably clean and tidy. The floor was covered with a thick, soft carpet of amber and black, very comfortable, like walking on grass. A magical teapot sat in the corner, still boiling and steaming without a fire, keeping the room at a comfortable temperature. It had been 2 years since they last met, and Ralph began recounting his amusing experiences at Hogwarts. Tina's previous grumbles and dissatisfaction vanished without a trace upon seeing him, and she finally smiled. Ralph breathed a sigh of relief. "I heard from Newt that you hired a witch named Sherry as an assistant at the school," Tina said with a half-smile. "Why didn't you mention that?" Ralph hadn't noticed Newt's talkativeness before. "What happened to the supposedly late-stage autism patient? Cured? That's a medical miracle." "Where did Grandpa go?" Ralph asked, feigning ignorance. "Install a lightning rod on the roof." Tina rubbed her forehead, a little annoyed. "There's this naughty thunderbird that's been bothering our house every day lately. It even broke my radio with its lightning. Your grandpa refuses to use magic to drive it away. He insists on installing a muggle lightning rod, but he's tried several times and it hasn't worked." Tina wanted to complain that magizoologists were all useless, but then she remembered that her grandson seemed to be going to do the same, so she swallowed her words. Newt was useless. The first time she met him, he had magizoologists all over New York, but Ralph wasn't. He was much more reliable than Newt. "I'll go check." Ralph stood up and gave Margaret a look, signaling her to appease her grandmother. "Put on your clothes first. That thunderbird is still in the sky." Tina took a robe from the hanger. The robe was made of special materials and had magic. It could block lightning. After changing his clothes, Ralph ran upstairs. He quickly reached the rooftop and saw Newt fiddling with an iron rod not far away. A short distance away, a half-grown thunderbird summoned lightning to strike Newt, trying to disrupt his work. Ralph whistled, and the thunderbird he had ridden soon appeared. It approached the smaller thunderbird and roared. The smaller thunderbird was frightened and immediately flew away. "Ralph, you're back." Newt turned and saw the boy, waving. "Don't scare it. Its mother died in childbirth, and I couldn't save her. It's been holding a grudge against me ever since." "I see." Ralph nodded, telling the larger thunderbird to stop chasing. "What's with this thunderbird?" Newt asked curiously. Ralph briefly recounted what had happened at the Native American tribe. "I've been to that tribe." Newt's eyes were hidden behind his thick bangs as he sighed softly. Back then, Pete was only in his 30s. More than 40 years have passed in the blink of an eye. "I never imagined you would have an accident." "You saw the feathered serpent's egg back then?" Ralph raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I stayed in that tribe for a long time, studying the fossil, but I didn't find anything special." "Could it hatch?" Ralph asked. "The feathered serpent god went extinct a long time ago, but the Native Americans say that it can rise from its eggs," Newt said, narrowing his eyes. "But whether it's the Maya, the Inca, or the Aztecs, all the Native American regimes have found many fossil eggs and tried to bring them back several times, but all have failed." Loth looked thoughtful, glancing at Newt as he installed the lightning rod. "Why do you only have a lightning rod, not a grounding device?" he asked, puzzled. "Grounding device?" Newt asked, surprised. "What's that? Isn't it just a matter of putting an iron rod on the roof?" the old man asked, puzzled. "I've seen muggles install them like that." Loft couldn't help but fassop him. No wonder it always failed. Newt suddenly put his arm around the boy and whispered, "Loft, don't tell Tina, don't tell your grandma, grandpa, you know me." Loft nodded, assuring him, "I definitely won't tell anyone," the boy silently added in his mind. "Yeah, right." Chapter 296 Tina, I hate Dumbledore. Newt didn't want to harm the little Thunderbird and wanted to use love to reform it, which was his usual approach. However, the Thunderbird's daily lightning strikes were disrupting their daily lives, especially Tina's. Newt, of course, wanted to solve the problem, so he thought of installing a lightning rod to conduct electricity. As a wizard, he was clearly not very knowledgeable about Muggle technology, even though lightning rods weren't particularly advanced. Fortunately, Ralph was knowledgeable and helped out, but not by installing a lightning rod, but by installing a lightning protection network. The basic principle of a lightning protection network is a Faraday cage, which uses a steel mesh within a reinforced concrete structure to shield against lightning, providing much wider protection than a lightning rod. The downside was the complicated installation. Ralph and Newt worked tirelessly, finishing everything by evening. Tina prepared a sumptuous dinner, a honey cake baked with blackberries and nuts, cured pork leg, breaded and fried starfish, and a dish of onions, cactus, and eggs cooked with plenty of pepper and chili. This was supposedly a traditional Arizona flavor, but after just one small bite, Rove was already sweating profusely from the spiciness and dared not eat any more. He didn't want to bleed that night and become a man with a violent temper. Tina seemed quite interested in Rove's assistant, repeatedly inquiring about Shirley at the dinner table. The reason was simple: someone had once had a capable and competent female assistant. Speaking of which, Rove had met Newt's assistant, Bondi, who was indeed a very gentle elder compared to Tina. Of course, he couldn't say this in front of Tina, otherwise she would show Rove what true gentleness meant. While Newt was in the restroom, Tina quietly said to Rove and Marjorie, "Bundy was madly in love with your grandfather back then, just like the Niffler was obsessed with Galleon. But I'm not worried at all. I don't see Bondi as a rival." "Why?" Rove asked with interest. "Although they've known each other for a long time," Tina said confidently, "Bondi doesn't really understand Newt." "Grandma Tina, what do you like about Grandpa Newt?" Margaret asked curiously. "I heard from Grandma that when Grandpa Newt was young, he was a very dull and withdrawn wizard, not as humorous as my grandfather. In this life, a gentle heart is often more precious than pride, wisdom, or courage." Tina gently smoothed her white hair, a smile appearing on her face. "I feel a warmth in Newt, a gentleness I've never seen in any other man." "What are you talking about?" Newt peeked out from the bathroom, asking nervously, "Why are you deliberately lowering your voice, darling?" "We're talking about Dumbledore," Tina said, turning her head. "Oh, Albus is an honest and good man, Tina," Newt said thoughtfully. "Don't say things like I was tricked by him, it'll affect Ralph and Marjorie's impression of Albus." Tina sighed slightly and muttered, "I hate Dumbledore, he's harder to deal with than Bondi." After dinner, Ralph and Newt went into their black boxes. They crossed a house and came to an open space where many magical cages were piled up. The cages were filled with all sorts of dangerous magical creatures, all of which Ralph had taken from Scamander's mysterious circus. They frantically rammed and pounded on the cages, the iron cages shaking and scraping against the ground, making a grating sound. Ralph picked up a bucket of meat slices, reached his left hand into the blood-red chunks of meat, and threw it into the cage. The screams and roars gradually subsided. But there were also two smaller hippogriffs in a cage, fighting each other for a piece of meat, feathers flying everywhere. Ralph quickly grabbed another handful and tossed it to one of them. These magical creatures were alright at first, then I tried releasing some of the slightly more docile animals from their cages, Ralph sighed. But after a few days, they went berserk, attacking everywhere and even tearing at their own flesh. Ralph had originally wanted to expand his harem, although he had recently taken in new favorites like the Dream Eater and the Thunderbird, who would complain about having too many treasures. But he hadn't expected these magical creatures from the mysterious circus to be so abnormally erratic, like dogs with rabies. This was very abnormal. Like the Thunderbird, once tamed, it was very obedient even when Ralph handled it. These animals performing in the circus should be much more docile. Scamander must have given them some special drugs, addictive ones. Newt glanced at the magical creatures and shook his head. "If we suddenly stop, they'll suffer a lot." This is one way Scamander prevents them from escaping. Leave it to me, Nit said in a deep voice. To restore their health, we need to break their addiction. It's not something that can be done overnight, it requires patience. Ralph nodded slightly. With Newt's help, things would be much easier. Oh, and this too. Ralph took a small bottle from his pocket. Professor Dumbledore asked me to bring this to you. Nit opened the bottle, and a small, black, oily substance emerged. The substance spun continuously, releasing a turbulent magical fluctuation. It was an obscurus, a life form that Dumbledore had extracted from Lockhart's body. Why did the headmaster ask me to bring you an obscurus? Ralph asked curiously. Albus probably wants me to nurture this obscurus, to prevent it from dying so quickly, Nit said after thinking for a moment. Ralph raised his eyebrows, somewhat surprised. According to records, the obscurial dies when its host dies. Dumbledore's ability to extend the obscurial's lifespan already surprised Ralph. He hadn't expected Newt to be even stronger, capable of keeping it outside its host for extended periods, like raising a magical creature. Truly the greatest magizoologist of all time. Newt stared at the black mass in midair and sighed softly. I once met two obscurials. One was a girl from Sudan whose mother was murdered, and she became an obscurial. I wanted to save her, but she died in the end. Then came Credence, Aberforth's son. Aberforth wanted to save him. I researched for a long time, and after many failures, I finally discovered how to raise an obscurial detached from its host. What have you discovered? Ralph asked. An obscurial detached from its host needs to constantly absorb human emotions to survive indefinitely, Nit explained. Sounds a lot like Dementors, Ralph said suspiciously. The two are indeed strikingly similar. Newt narrowed his eyes and nodded. They are both non-existent dark creatures that feed on people's emotions. A Dementor's kiss will drain a wizard's soul, turning them into a mindless shell. An obscurus will also destroy the host's soul, leaving only an empty shell. Newt was silent for a moment. Then finally said, because of this extreme similarity, I even suspected at one point that Dementors were also born from some kind of humanoid creature, and then detached from it, like an obscurus, Nit nodded. Only that kind of creature is much more powerful than a wizard, so only a Dementor detached from it can survive alone in the wild. Chapter 297 Prison Break. All living things go through the processes of birth, death, and reproduction. But Dementors are an exception. They are immortal, transcending life and death, and to this day, no one has ever truly witnessed how they reproduce. The British Ministry of Magic claims that Dementors, like fungi, are born out of thin air in the most decaying, darkest places, but the truth is, apart from the island where Dementors were first discovered, no one in the world has ever heard of a wild Dementor being born. Contrary to the rumors, Nit said softly, sitting on his cage and gazing at the distant forest. The places where Dementors are born are incredibly pure. One wizard even commented that Dementors are the purest creatures in the world. Who said that? Ralph asked curiously. Ixtus, Nit said softly. He was the first wizard to discover Dementors and settled on the island where they were found, building a fortress specifically to study them. Later, Ixtus suddenly disappeared, and no one knows where he went, Nit said solemnly. Disappeared suddenly? Yes, disappeared suddenly, Nit said with certainty. Ixtus's things are still on the island, his clothes, notebooks, gold, they're all still there. With Ixtus's disappearance, the magic he cast near the island stopped working, and that's when the Ministry of Magic noticed the island and the Dementors on it. The Ministry of Magic also found various documents Ixtus left behind, Nit said in a low voice. I worked in the Department of Magical Creatures Control back then, and I inadvertently came into contact with some of these documents. Later, I went to Azkaban specifically to study the Dementors. 2 years ago at Christmas, on the Orient Express, Mundungus mentioned that he had met you in Azkaban. Ralph suddenly said. Mundungus? Haha, I did run into him, Nit chuckled. He even helped me out a bit, allowing me to avoid the Dementors and explore the island. What did you see? I saw. Nit rubbed his temples, recalling, in the center of the island, there was a small lake, its water crystal clear. Then a man emerged from the bottom of the lake, like a bubble rising from the depths, but shortly after coming ashore, the man aged rapidly, his cheeks rotting, leaving only empty eye sockets, and a large hole appeared in his mouth. In the end, he looked exactly like a Dementor. Ralph was somewhat surprised. This sounded very much like the process of well-preserved 1,000-year-old corpses in tombs rapidly oxidizing upon contact with fresh air. What's beneath the lake? The boy asked curiously. I don't know, Nit shook his head. I was quickly discovered by the Dementors. They're guarding the area. Ralph fell into deep thought. So, the Dementors were born at the bottom of that lake. A storm swept across the entire sea. A fierce wind whipped up the seawater, wave after wave crashing and churning. A black carriage struggled to fly above the sea, the howling wind making it rock violently like a ship on the water. 7 Thestrals pulled the carriage, their manes crackling in the wind, yet they flew steadily towards the distant island without a wizard's guidance. Their destination was Azkaban. Inside the carriage sat 4 wizards, 3 aurors and a criminal. The criminal's hands and feet were chained, and his body was bound with magical ropes. Any attempt to use magic, even the slightest magical fluctuation, would immediately cause the ropes to tighten and strangle him. The prisoner sobbed, wailing like a baby, crying out that he didn't want to go to Azkaban, which greatly annoyed the aurors beside him. "Shut up, Peter Pettigrew," Cooper yelled. "If you cry again, I'll cut off your manhood and feed it to the Thestrals." Peter was terrified. He immediately shut up, not uttering another word or wailing, but his nose was still twitching. "Don't frighten Peter, Cooper. From what I've observed, this guy is really a coward," the tall wizard beside him whistled and chuckled evilly. "If you ask me, he needs to be slapped a few times and then whipped severely, and he'll be completely quiet." Peter was terrified and didn't even dare to twitch. "You have quite the taste, Dane." Cooper looked at Peter again and sneered. "Peter Pettigrew, you'll be locked up in Azkaban until your bones turn to ash. That's what you deserve, isn't it, Delilah?" Cooper looked at the short-haired man who hadn't spoken since they set off. Delilah nodded slightly. "That's right." Just then, a blinding flash of lightning pierced the carriage window, illuminating the entire carriage, brighter than the sun on a clear day. Cooper leaned close to the window and looked out. He shouted, "I hate rainstorms." Thunder drowned out his words, as well as Delilah's voice. Another flash of lightning appeared in the distance, dazzlingly bright. For some reason, Cooper glimpsed a green light through his glasses. Just as Cooper was about to turn around, a hand grabbed his hair, dragged his head, and slammed it against the wall. The force of the impact made it almost impossible for him to breathe. Cooper's wand was knocked away, and a black rope bound him tightly like a cocoon. He fell to the ground, his pupils dilated. Dane had been killed in his seat by Avada Kedavra, his face filled with terror, his death gruesome. But it wasn't Peter Pettigrew who had done it. He was still firmly bound in his seat. The one who had done it was Delilah. Everything happened so fast that Cooper hadn't even had time to react before he saw Delilah open the carriage door and drag him out. Cooper stretched out his feet, trying to hook his waist around the chair, but he exerted too much force, and his feet only grazed the smooth surface of the seat. Delilah dragged Cooper out of the carriage, and below was the vast sea. Cooper dangled in midair, gasping for breath. "Why?" Cooper cried. "Delilah, shut up." Delilah snapped, "If you shout again, I'll cut off your manhood and feed it to the Thestrals." Delilah raised his wand, aimed it at Cooper, and after a flash of green light, his body plummeted into the sea. Delilah returned to the carriage and raised his wand at Peter. Peter stared intently at Delilah, feeling nauseous but unable to vomit. His nails dug deep into his arms, he trembled violently, and sobbed uncontrollably. Delilah's appearance suddenly changed rapidly, as if the Polyjuice potion had reached its time limit. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Peter saw the face clearly. He gasped in terror, his jaw dropping and his breath coming in gasps. You, the man placed Cooper's wand in Peter's hand and whispered, "Remember, head east, to the Albanian forest, to find the Dark Lord. He's waiting for you." Brothers, this chapter is from yesterday. It was under review all night. I had to contact the editor this morning to release it. Sorry. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 298, Lifting a Rock Only to Drop It on One's Own Foot. The 2 bodies were carried ashore, their limbs twisted, their bodies swollen, and their faces, ravaged by fish bites, were pitted and scarred. Fudge felt his breakfast churning in his stomach, but he forced himself to purse his lips, turned his head, and asked, "Who can tell me how they died?" "Drowned." Scrimgeour squatted down beside the corpses, examining his men. His face was grim. "Killing curse? Who did it?" Fudge shouted in disgust. Peter Pettigrew? In those restraints, he could still kill 3 Aurors. If Peter could do that, he wouldn't be Wormtail, he'd be the Dark Lord. A lame man glared, his voice gruff. A Death Eater must have rescued him. Death Eaters? Fudge gasped. He quickly denied it. No, Moody, the Death Eaters have been in Azkaban for a long time. Under my management, the wizarding world has been peaceful these past few years. Where would a Death Eater come from? Isn't Peter Pettigrew a Death Eater? Moody scoffed. He's been on the run for 11 years without being caught, and there are probably many accomplices like him still at large. Like Malfoy? Don't talk nonsense. Fudge nervously fiddled with his top hat, forcing a smile as he said in a low voice, Lucius was under the Imperious curse back then, and he's long been proven innocent. Innocent? Moody stared at Fudge, his demonic eyes darting around in their sockets. Fudge disliked the eyeball. It reminded him of how Moody had killed the Death Eaters. But he continued, undeterred, besides, Lucius has always been a strong supporter of the Ministry. Next year, with the Quidditch World Cup, there's a huge shortfall in stadium construction, and Lucius generously donated a large sum of gold. He's a rare good man, a good man. Moody's already crooked mouth became even more contorted. He forced a smile and said, if donating a lot of gold makes someone a good man, then Malfoy certainly fits the bill, since he's never stingy with galleons. Minister, if I may ask, how much gold should I donate to change your opinion of Malfoy? Moody, do you think I'm a chameleon? Fudge roared in anger. Of course, did I see wrong? Moody twirled his magic eye again, then suddenly looked surprised. Well, I did see wrong. You're not a chameleon, you're a greedy niffler. Fudge was furious. He looked around to make sure several Aurors were protecting him before yelling, Moody, watch your tone. I'm still your minister, show some respect. Not anymore, Moody roared at Fudge. I'm retiring. You can't control me anymore. Moody limped away, and a deathly silence fell over the surroundings, broken only by the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. After Moody had walked away, Fudge, his expression shifting between anger and uncertainty, cursed, that old bastard, Mad-Eye, he's just taking advantage of his seniority. Rufus, aren't you going to do anything about your men? Connolly, Alastair's about to retire, how can I possibly manage them? Scrimgeour stood up and said, besides, he treats me like this all the time. You're the chief of staff of the Auror office, Fudge exclaimed. But my seniority is far less than Moody's, Scrimgeour retorted, neither too firm nor too soft. He fills half the cells in Azka's cell, and he personally trained many young Aurors. If Moody hadn't refused, he would have been the chief of staff of the Auror office long ago. I should have given Peter a kiss, Fudge said, somewhat annoyed. That's something to worry about after we catch him, Scrimgeour said gravely. Cornell, the most urgent thing is to send Aurors to conduct a full-scale manhunt for Peter. The Ministry of Magic will also hold a press conference to inform all wizards of this, warning them to be cautious. Peter is an illegal animagus. He might try the same trick again, hiding in someone's house as a rat. Fudge remained silent. If it were any other prisoner who escaped, it wouldn't be a problem, but it had to be Peter Pettigrew. Catching Peter and clearing Black's name was Fudge's biggest achievement in his 3 years in office. He had also used this incident to attack Crouch, suspending and investigating this political enemy. To boost his own prestige, major newspapers, at Fudge's suggestion, had been reporting on Peter daily, extolling his terror. With the propaganda of various authorities and experts, Peter's image in the public eye was almost that of the second in command of the Death Eaters, second only to Voldemort. But now the tables had turned, losing Peter would inevitably cause immense panic. He couldn't very well tell everyone that Peter wasn't dangerous at all, just a minor figure among the Death Eaters. That wouldn't just be a backlash from public opinion, he'd definitely be labeled an incompetent fool. It would be like shooting himself in the foot. Umbridge glanced at Fudge, knowing what the minister was thinking, and then gave Scrimgeour a fawning smile. Mr. Scrimgeour, to be honest, I truly understand your urgency. We all know that Peter's escape is a terrible and awful thing, a disaster. But we in power must always prioritize the well-being of all wizards. How so? Scrimgeour raised an eyebrow. Announcing Peter's escape now would cause unnecessary panic among the public and disrupt their lives. Next year is the Quidditch World Cup, and at this crucial juncture, the scandal of Peter's escape would inevitably affect the tournament. We must prioritize the greater good, Scrimgeour scoffed. So we're just going to let this go, pretending Peter Pettigrew is already imprisoned in Azkaban? No, I mean we shouldn't publicize it yet, We should suppress it, Umbridge laughed. It would be best if Peter showed up himself, then we could immediately pinpoint his location. If he doesn't, we can send Orange to search for him. Scrimgeour, barely containing his anger, asked, Minister, do you agree? Dolores has a point. I'll think about it, Fudge replied vaguely. Scrimgeour snorted and turned to walk away, his fur cloak billowing behind him. After he was gone, Fudge and Umbridge exchanged a brief glance. These guys, they have absolutely no respect for me, their minister, Fudge flared up. He said to Umbridge, keep this under wraps. Don't let anyone leak it out. A beetle crawled up Fudge's collar, the sound of its wings flapping making him even more irritated. He patted his clothes and said, Rita Skeeter mustn't find out about this. If that woman finds out, she'll definitely spread it around. Yes, sir, Umbridge grumbled. The beetle, driven away, hovered in the air before returning and landing on Fudge. Chapter 299 The Ifemoni Airship. This summer, Britain was destined for turmoil, but it wouldn't affect Rove, far away in America, for the time being. Throughout July, he followed Newt across Arizona, traversing this ancient land on foot. As a protected area, it was home to a vast number of thunderbirds, a diverse array of shapes and sizes, so even the most discerning magizoologist could find a charming little creature to suit their taste. Besides thunderbirds, countless other magical creatures roamed the area, bark scorpions that photosynthesize, rock-eating giant lizards, snake women who seduced boys and stole virginity. Rove saw them all, especially the snake women. He even followed Newt to a cave in the Grand Canyon, where they discovered a completely new magical fish. Newt wrote a paper about this new species and submitted it to the top magical journal, Fantastic Beasts, with Rove even getting a second authorship. He truly made a significant contribution. He wasn't just coasting along. Rove worked tirelessly from dawn till dusk, preparing bait, and recording data in the dark caves, all meticulous work. Newt was also planning his new book, Fantastic Beasts, a sister book to Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Although Tina always complained, urging Newt to hurry up and write, saying they were running out of toilet paper, the book's quality was actually very high. Many of the photos in the book were taken by Ralph at close range. Sometimes, to capture images of animals mating, he would even personally strip down and help instruct. Besides observing magical creatures, Ralph would also deal with thieves, most of whom were wizards who had illegally crossed over from neighboring Mexico. However, 20 years later, under the urging of a man named Trump, a border wall about 10 meters high would be built here to stop Mexican civilians from smuggling themselves across. Amidst his busy schedule, Ralph still diligently studied medicine with Newt. He needed to treat Hagrid's eight-eyed spider, Aragog, for cataracts, which was crucial to whether he could become Hogwarts Spider-Man. Ralph was incredibly fulfilled during this leisurely time, but something soon disrupted his rhythm. He received a letter. The letter was sent by Dumbledore, and delivered by Headmaster Alvermorny. Uriel Hicks. Sitting in his chair, Ralph read the letter several times before falling silent. What did Albus say in the letter? Nit asked, somewhat surprised that Dumbledore wasn't writing to him. This was very unusual. Professor Dumbledore said that Peter Pettigrew escaped. Ralph handed the letter to Newt, a complex expression on his face. Sirius didn't escape, but Peter Pettigrew did? Fudge really is a useless piece of trash to have Peter escape like that. Ralph cursed under his breath and sighed. I have to go back to England immediately. Ralph, why are you going back? Tina asked, reluctant to part with her beloved grandson. Is the British Ministry of Magic so incompetent that you, a child, have to go back to catch the Death Eaters? Grandma, I'm not going back to catch Peter, but to protect Sherry and Hermione, Ralph explained softly. When I interrogated Peter, they were watching. Peter knows they're my friends. If I'm not in England, he might go after them for revenge. Ralph sighed. Professor Dumbledore has already sent wizards to protect them, but I'm still a little worried. Peter has escaped now, and given his cowardly nature, he probably wouldn't dare to come back for revenge, but who can completely guarantee that? Ralph didn't want to regret it later. That wasn't his style. Dumbledore knew about this, which was why he wrote to him. Hurry up and pack your things, I'm going to visit Bugsbuttons, and I'll stop by Hogwarts on the way, Professor Hicks said with a slight smile. Little Scamander, I'll take you. How will we get there, Professor? Ralph asked curiously. On the Mayflower. No. Hicks shook his head and pointed to the sky. We'll ride that thing. Ralph looked up at the sky, where a cylindrical gas bag over 50 meters long floated in midair, with an aluminum gondola below. It was a huge airship. Seeing the boy frown, Hicks asked in confusion, "What's wrong? Is it safe?" Ralph asked worriedly, "Won't it explode?" It's not surprising that Ralph was so nervous. As an airship that was once on par with airplanes, it was indeed notorious for its insecurity. The principle of an airship is to fill the gas bag with a buoyant gas that is less dense than air, thereby generating buoyancy to lift it into the air. For a long time, the gas bag was filled with flammable and explosive hydrogen. Most people are terrified to drive past a gas tanker truck, fearing it might explode. Imagine having hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of hydrogen gas overhead. No wonder they're scared. The infamous Zeppelin airship, the Hindenburg, caught fire and burned while carrying passengers, killing dozens. But being a magical airship, its safety should be significantly enhanced. Rove quickly packed his things, grabbed his black suitcase, and said goodbye to Newt and Tina. Margaret wasn't there. She'd recently returned to New York, so they could only say goodbye through the two-way mirror. Rove followed Hicks down a staircase towards the airship. Looking up, he could see the gas bags were fully inflated, resembling a sleeping whale. Several feet high on the gas bags were the letters, Alphamoni. This airship was Alphamoni's mode of transport, capable of carrying many students on long-distance trips. Entering the cabin, Rove entered a large living room with a bright chandelier overhead. In the center was a table laden with crystal goblets and a large platter of fruit. As a wizard untied the anchor cable, the propellers began to spin, and the giant machine slowly rose, its valves creaking and hissing. Ralph sat in his chair, looking out the window as the airship slowly took off, plunging into the thick clouds. The view from the window was magnificent. Ralph admired it for about half an hour when suddenly the cabin began to shake. The floor tilted briefly, sinking almost imperceptibly to the east, and the wind changed from occasional gusts to a constant, low howl. Soon, a wizard rushed in, explaining, "Professor Hicks, it's a Thunderbird, it's attacking the airship." "Ralph, I see." Hicks poured herself a glass of lemonade, looked at the boy, and asked, "Ralph, are you scared?" "Yes, Professor," Ralph frankly admitted. "Sitting under hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of hydrogen gas is indeed making me a little anxious." "The gas bags will be fine." Professor Hicks sipped her lemonade, reassuring him, "The Thunderbird's lightning will only bypass the leather hull and roast us inside this giant lightning rod." "Thank you for your comforting words, Professor." "You're welcome." Chapter 300. Ralph, Sherry, it's been a long time. At Hogwarts Castle, several stone gargoyles stood atop the building, water dripping from their gaping mouths and splashing into bottles. Snape stood to one side, waiting for the bottles to fill with dew, while scrutinizing the gargoyles' designs: a lion's head, a honey badger's body, an eagle's wings, and a basilisk's tail, its tip slightly upturned. "So ugly," Snape thought to himself, criticizing the four leaders' aesthetic sense, especially that lion's head, ugly and stupid, practically identical to a Gryffindor student. Soon the bottles were full, and Snape replaced them with new ones. He had recently been studying potions books from the Far East, where potion makers had put forward many interesting ideas, such as water having a significant impact on the quality and taste of potions. They believed that mountain water was the best choice for brewing potions, followed by river water, and lastly well water, each further divided into different grades. There were also corresponding sources of water such as rain, dew, frost, and snow, water without roots. Snape wholeheartedly agreed with this view. He had collected snow from plum blossom petals, stored it in a cauldron, sealed it, and buried it underground. 2 years later, he would retrieve it to brew a potion for constipation. Adding just a little aged snow water made it very effective at relieving constipation. Whenever Dumbledore visited Snape, to show respect for the headmaster, Snape would bring out rainwater stored for years to brew in hand-ground coffee. As for why Dumbledore always felt unwell after drinking the coffee, Snape's explanation was, wild boars can't stomach fine chaff. Snape gazed into the distance. From this spot, the entire Hogwarts skyline was laid out before him. He closed his eyes, enjoying this rare tranquility. Once school started and those annoying fellows returned, he wouldn't be able to enjoy this peace anymore. Suddenly, a drop of water fell onto his dark hair, trickling down his hooked nose and into his mouth. The droplet tasted 3 parts spicy, 3 parts bitter, and 4 parts oily. Well, that was the smell of his hair. "It's raining." Snape looked up in surprise. his eyes widening suddenly. A streak of blue light descended from the sky like a meteor, hurtling towards him. Snape's heart skipped a beat. In an instant, he leaned to the right, his body planted firmly on the ground. A flash of light disappeared right where he had been standing, near his heart, before exploding with a deafening roar in the distance and shattering into countless fragments. Snape stared intently. What had attacked him was a lump of blue ice. How could ice be falling from the sky at this time of year, especially such a large, blue block of ice he had never seen before? Was this also water without roots? As a potions master, Snape was immediately suspicious and prepared to collect it to study this mysterious ice carefully. Just then, a rumbling sound echoed in the sky. Snape looked up again, speechless with shock for several seconds. He thought the falling ice was absurd enough, but something even more outrageous was about to happen. A massive airship pierced the clouds, plummeting towards the ground, billowing thick smoke. The airship finally began to slow, but still crashed into the Gryffindor Tower, leaving a dazzling trail of sparks. The spire was snapped off, breaking into numerous fragments that flew everywhere. The airship was also physically slowed down, finally coming to a stop. Moments later, the cabin door opened, and a boy carrying a black suitcase, covering his mouth and nose, rushed out of the smoke. Ralph saw the dumbfounded man in the distance, waved, and called out, "Professor Snape, long time no see, Snape." Ralph walked down the stairs to a platform, his eye twitching involuntarily. This was actually the top of the Gryffindor Tower. A large hole had been smashed in the ceiling, and he could clearly see the scene in the common room. "Oh dear, Professor Hicks, you've made a huge hole in the roof of the Gryffindor common room." Professor Hicks quickly emerged, a helpless smile playing on her lips at the sight. They were traveling via Canada, Greenland, and Iceland, bypassing the Atlantic, which would have allowed them to reach England quickly. The problem was, the weather in Greenland was too cold, freezing the airship and causing the landing malfunction. A ball of fire burned in midair, and Dumbledore appeared on the roof, Fawkes perched on his shoulder. Dumbledore was also stunned by the sight. Thankfully, Professor McGonagall wasn't at the school, or she would have certainly been furious. "Albus, I didn't mean to," Professor Hicks said apologetically. "I'll fix it, it's all right, Uriel," Dumbledore said softly. "Long time no see." After exchanging pleasantries for a while, the headmaster looked at the young man and said, "Rolf, welcome back, Professor." "Hello," Rolf said, then chatted with Dumbledore about Newt and Tina's recent situation. "Let's go to my office first. We'll deal with things here later," Dumbledore said finally. "I'm sorry, Professor, I'd like to go to London first," Ralph refused. Dumbledore nodded and smiled. "I'll have Fawkes take you." Fawkes took flight, circled once, and then flew low above Ralph. The boy raised a hand, tightly grasped Fawkes's long golden tail, and vanished completely in a burst of flame. London, W1 District, 7 Charing Cross West, Granger Dental Clinic. A young girl sat at the counter, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, extremely plain, yet her beauty was undeniable. A burgundy ponytail hung from one shoulder to her waist as she gently flipped through a copy of the New York Ghost. There had been reports about that guy in the newspaper in July, but recently there had been no news at all. Shirley rested her chin on her hand, lost in thought. "Excuse me, is Granger's clinic still open?" a very low voice suddenly asked. Shirley didn't look up. She said softly, "I'm sorry, Mr. Granger is away studying, so the clinic is temporarily closed." The clinic hadn't been open all summer, but Hermione and Shirley had come every few days to clean and keep the rooms tidy. Today was cleaning day, otherwise, they usually wouldn't have come. The deep voice persisted, "But my tooth really hurts. Can you help me treat it? I remember, you pulled a tooth for an invisible beast, didn't you?" The girl looked up sharply. She saw a boy carrying a black suitcase standing at the clinic entrance, smiling broadly at her. On his suitcase stood a phoenix, Fawkes. Ralph smiled and walked into the clinic. "Long time no see, Shirley." Shirley stood up with a look of surprise, walked around the counter, and ran towards Ralph. After stopping, she said softly, "You're back." Ralph nodded. "I'm back." Silence fell between them for a moment. The boy and girl said simultaneously, "You've gained weight, you've gotten a tan." Silence again. Shirley suddenly chuckled, squinting her eyes. "Have I gained a lot of weight?" "You've gained some weight since before the holidays, but you're still a bit thin. It would be better if you gained a little more. You've grown quite a bit taller though." Ralph carefully examined Shirley. The girl with a ponytail was now taller and more slender than when they first met. Her features had matured, making her even more beautiful. Ralph looked around and asked curiously, "Why are you alone? Where's Hermione?" "This was Granger's clinic, I just finished cleaning. Hermione went to the bookstore to buy books. She'll be back in a bit," Shirley explained softly. She frowned and asked, "Does your tooth hurt?" "No, it doesn't." Ralph flicked the girl's forehead with a finger. "Just kidding." Shirley glared at the boy, then suddenly blinked. "How about I check your teeth? If it's really nothing, I can even clean them for you." "You can clean teeth?" Ralph asked in surprise. "I've been learning this from Hermione lately." Shirley smiled, gently urging, "Hurry up and lie down on the chair." Ralph complied, lying down on the chair. Shirley sat beside him and asked, "How's the trunk?" "It's fine, still as clean as ever." Ralph hesitated for a moment, then honestly replied, "Well, it's been a mess lately. I haven't cleaned it much. Without your help, it looks like a jumble." Shirley smiled and asked, "Are you complimenting me?" Ralph smiled brightly. "Of course." The girl with the ponytail gazed at the boy's smiling face. After looking away, she whispered, "So handsome." "What?" "I said your teeth are really handsome." The girl laughed. "Your teeth are handsome too." End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.